I never told my son what I kept in the old brick building by the marina. When his new wife started hunting for it, I made sure she would never find the truth. While I was repairing an engine at home, my shop foreman called me in an absolute panic. He said my daughter-in-law was at the docks with a locksmith and a moving truck. I had been waiting for this exact moment. What I did next changed the course of their lives forever. My name is Simon. I am 70 years old and I spent 4 decades building a marine salvage empire from nothing. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth. Growing up in a tough coastal neighborhood taught me the value of silence and hard work. I built my business, Atlantic Marine Salvage, with calloused hands and salt in my lungs. My son Aaron grew up with the privileges I never had. I was elbow-deep in grease rebuilding a transmission in my home garage when my cell phone vibrated violently against the metal workbench. It was Hector, my foreman. His voice cracked through the speaker, competing with the high-pitched screech of a heavy-duty power drill. "Boss, she is drilling the lock right now." I wiped the thick black grease from my hands using a rag. I looked at the old grandfather clock on my kitchen wall. It was 10 in the morning on a Tuesday. My bones ached from a lifetime of hauling scrap metal out of the freezing ocean, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. "Who is drilling the lock, Hector?" I asked. My voice remained entirely flat. "Your daughter-in-law, Megan," Hector replied. His panic bled through the receiver. "She brought a commercial locksmith and a heavy-duty moving truck. I told her the brick building by the docks is strictly off limits. She shoved some legal paper in my face and told me to back off or she would have me arrested and fired. Tell the crew to stand down," I ordered. "Let her open it. I am on my way." I tossed the rag onto the counter. I did not rush. Panic is the weapon of the guilty. I walked out to my rusted 1998 Chevy pickup. Megan had mocked this truck at every family dinner since Aaron married her. She called it an embarrassing eyesore. I called it a reminder of exactly where I came from. I drove the 4 miles to the marina at a steady pace. The salty breeze hit my face through the open window, carrying the familiar sense of diesel and low tide. I pulled into the gravel lot and saw the chaotic scene unfolding. Megan's pristine white Range Rover blocked the main loading bay. She stood in front of the old brick storage building, her arms crossed tightly over her expensive designer trench coat. The locksmith killed the drill and stepped back, wiping sweat from his forehead. The heavy steel padlock hit the concrete with a loud ringing clang. I stepped out of my truck. The gravel crunched under my steel-toed boots as I approached them. "You are trespassing on private commercial property," I stated clearly. Megan spun around. Her blonde hair whipped across her face. She did not look caught or embarrassed. She looked utterly triumphant. "We are taking inventory, Simon," she sneered. Her voice dripped with absolute unearned entitlement. "Aaron told me you have been hoarding his grandfather's vintage silver and antique maritime navigational tools in this crumbling shack. We need the liquid capital for the down payment on our new corporate office. You have absolutely no right to be here, and Aaron has no authority over my property," I said, stepping closer to the door. Megan reached into her oversized designer bag. She pulled out a thick, notarized document and slapped it aggressively against my chest. I caught it before it hit the ground. "Read it carefully," she commanded. "It is an irrevocable power of attorney. Aaron convinced a judge that your mind is rapidly failing. You forgot to pay the property taxes on the house last month. You mixed up Aaron's birthday. The court granted him full control of your estate yesterday afternoon. Everything you own is ours now." I looked down at the document in my hands. The signature at the bottom was a flawless forgery of my handwriting. I had not forgotten the property taxes. I paid them 6 months in advance directly to the city. I did not mix up Aaron's birthday. I simply refused to attend the extravagant, pretentious country club dinner Megan hosted on my dime. They had manufactured an entire false narrative to strip me of my human rights. I stood there clutching the paper, watching Megan motion for the locksmith to pull the door open. I recalled building this salvage yard from a single broken skiff 40 years ago. I worked 18-hour days pulling drowned vessels from the deep turning rusted scrap into a highly respected local empire. I wanted my son to have the best. I sent Aaron to the finest business school in the state, paying every single tuition bill in cold hard cash. I wanted him to understand commerce and leadership. Instead, he learned how to steal. He always hated the smell of diesel and fish that lingered on my clothes. He preferred country clubs, luxury cars, and people like Megan who measured a man's worth by his zip code. The locksmith gripped the heavy steel handle of the brick building. He looked at me nervously, clearly sensing the hostility in the air. I gave him a single curt nod. He pulled the door open. The rusted hinges shrieked loudly, echoing across the quiet marina. Megan pushed past him eagerly, her eyes wide with unearned greed. She stepped into the dim, dusty light of the storage building, fully expecting to find a treasure trove of silver and antiques to fund her lavish lifestyle. She froze in her tracks. There was no silver. There were no antique navigational tools. The vast brick room was entirely empty, save for 3 dented metal filing cabinets pushed against the far wall and a moldy tarp covering a pile of broken engine belts. "Where is it?" Megan shrieked. Her voice echoed off the empty brick walls. She kicked a stray piece of scrap metal in pure frustration. "Aaron swore you hid the valuables in here. I hid the maintenance logs for the forklift in here," I replied calmly. "You wasted $200 on a locksmith to steal 10-year-old receipts." Megan's face turned bright red. Her pristine facade shattered into pure venomous rage. She marched right up to me, pointing a manicured finger directly in my face. "You think this is funny, old man? We own you. Aaron is finalizing a massive commercial loan right now. We used your primary residence as collateral. If you try to fight this, I will have you thrown into a state-run nursing home so fast your head will spin." She stormed past me, her high heels clicking aggressively on the concrete. She climbed into her Range Rover and sped off, kicking up a massive cloud of white dust. Hector stepped out from behind the tool shed. He looked at me with deep concern etched into his weathered face. "Boss, she is taking your house. What are we going to do?" I folded the forged legal document and slid it into my coat pocket. "We are going to do exactly what we do best, Hector," I said, my voice hardening into solid steel. "We are going to let them sail into deep water. Then we are going to sink their boat." I did not waste another breath on Megan. Arguing with a thief only gives them the illusion of leverage. I turned my back on her pristine white SUV and climbed into the cab of my rusted Chevy. Hector stood by the tool shed, his weathered face tight with worry. I gave him a single reassuring nod before putting the truck in gear. The gravel crunched loudly under my tires as I pulled out of the marina lot. My mind was already 3 steps ahead of their amateur ambush. Megan and Aaron thought the forged power of attorney was a kill shot. They did not realize a piece of paper only holds power if the money is actually there to be taken. I drove straight toward the financial district of downtown. The midday traffic was light, allowing me to carefully calculate my exact sequence of moves. I needed to secure my liquid assets immediately. For decades, I kept a sizable operational fund in a standard commercial checking account at First National Bank to cover the marina's weekly expenses and emergency salvage equipment. It was $90,000 in cash sitting completely exposed. I parked 2 blocks away from the bank, ignoring the meter. I walked through the heavy glass doors of First National with absolute purpose. The marble floors gleamed under the crystal chandeliers, a stark contrast to the grease and salt of my world. I approached the teller window, pulling my state identification from my wallet. I intended to execute a unilateral wire transfer, moving every single cent from my checking account into a protective blind trust I had established years ago. I slid my ID across the polished counter. The young teller behind the thick security glass smiled politely. His name tag read Derek. I had known him since he started working here fresh out of high school. "Good morning, Mr. Vance," Derek said cheerfully. "How can I assist you today?" I kept my voice entirely steady. "I need to initiate an immediate wire transfer, Derek. I am moving the entire available balance of my primary commercial checking account into my secondary trust. Please prepare the authorization forms." Derek nodded and began typing rapidly on his keyboard. A few seconds passed. The rhythmic clicking of his keys suddenly stopped. His polite smile vanished, replaced by a deep, uncomfortable frown. He clicked his mouse several more times, his eyes darting across his monitor. He looked up at me, his face pale with sudden anxiety. "I apologize, Mr. Vance. I cannot process that transfer request." I kept my posture rigid, refusing to show a single ounce of surprise. "Explain the problem, Derek." "Your accounts have been flagged and completely frozen," the young man explained nervously. His voice dropped to an apologetic whisper. "A legal hold was placed on your portfolio at 9 o'clock this morning. Someone submitted a court-ordered power of attorney alongside a psychiatric medical hold. My system will not allow me to override a judge's mandate." I stared at him through the glass. Megan and Aaron had not just brought a locksmith to the marina. They had executed a synchronized financial strike. They forged my signature, bribed a medical professional for a fake psychiatric evaluation, and weaponized the court system to lock me out of my own life. They thought severing my access to my funds would leave me paralyzed and defenseless. I looked down at my rough, calloused hands resting on the bank counter. Those hands had bled for 40 years, hauling twisted metal from the bottom of the Atlantic. Every grueling salvage job, every frozen winter morning spent rebuilding diesel engines was entirely for Aaron. I grew up with absolutely nothing, wearing shoes with holes in the soles and sharing a single room with 3 brothers. I swore my son would never know the crushing weight of poverty or the suffocating burden of debt. When Aaron was accepted into an elite out-of-state business school, I did not let him take out a single student loan. I walked into the university's bursar office and paid his tuition, room and board in cold hard cash every single semester. I wanted him to understand the mechanics of high-level commerce so he could lead the marina into the next century. I gave him the finest financial education money could buy. I never imagined he would use that exact education to orchestrate the hostile takeover of his own father's life. He learned how to manipulate trusts, forge legal corporate documents, and bypass banking security protocols, and he was currently using those skills to destroy the man who funded them. Aaron hated the grime of the salvage yard. He hated the smell of the ocean. He craved the sterilized, ruthless world of corporate acquisitions, and he had decided my hard-earned cash would be his stepping stone. I felt a cold, calculated fury settle deep in my chest. He was a smart boy, but he lacked the fundamental grit required to survive a real war. I looked back at Derek, maintaining my unyielding composure. I need to know exactly what happened to the $90,000 in my commercial checking account. Derek swallowed hard, typing another command into his terminal. The funds are no longer in the account, Mr. Vance. The individual possessing the power of attorney initiated an external wire transfer an hour ago. The money was moved into a secure escrow holding. I leaned closer to the glass. Provide the details of the recipient account immediately. I am the primary account holder and I have a legal right to review the transaction history. Derek hesitated for a fraction of a second before turning his screen slightly so I could see the digital ledger. The $90,000 was wired to the corporate escrow account of Sterling Horizons Group. It is a luxury real estate development firm. The transaction notes indicate the funds are being used as a non-refundable cash down payment to secure a massive commercial acquisition. The pieces of their pathetic puzzle snapped perfectly into place. Aaron and Megan were not just trying to steal my savings. They were using my cash to buy a high-end real estate company, effectively laundering my marina's operational funds into their own pristine corporate portfolio. They needed that initial capital to prove their liquidity to a board of investors. They were building their glittering new empire on the stolen bones of my salvage business. I thanked Derek for his time and walked out of the bank. The midday sun beat down on the concrete sidewalk. Aaron and Megan had struck the first blow, believing they had stripped me of my armor. They were completely unaware that my true wealth was buried far out of their reach. I left the financial district behind and navigated the familiar cracked pavement of my neighborhood. My house was a single-story brick craftsman I bought 45 years ago. It was not a mansion, but it was paid for, and it was mine. I pulled my rusted Chevy into the driveway and immediately hit the brakes. A massive commercial moving truck idled on my front lawn, crushing my hydrangeas. The front door was propped wide open. I stepped out of the truck, the cold wind biting at my collar. Strangers in matching gray uniforms carried heavy cardboard boxes out of my front hallway. I walked up the concrete steps and crossed the threshold. The living room was a scene of absolute desecration. 4 men were systematically dismantling the life I had built. One of them was wrapping packing tape around the oak rocking chair my late wife used to sit in. Standing in the center of the chaos was Megan. She wore her designer trench coat, pointing a manicured finger toward the hallway closet. In her other hand, she casually held my favorite ceramic coffee mug, the one with the chipped handle that my wife bought me for our 10th anniversary. She took a slow sip, looking completely at ease in a home she was actively destroying. She was not just packing up furniture. She was erasing my history. The absolute audacity of her presence suffocated the room. I stood in the doorway, my fists clenching at my sides. She noticed me and did not even flinch. She simply offered a patronizing, tight-lipped smile. "Right on time, Simon," she announced loudly. "We are clearing out the junk so the real estate agents can stage the property tomorrow morning. This prime lot is going straight on the market." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I locked eyes with the foreman of the moving crew, a burly man carrying a stack of framed family photographs. "Put those down," I commanded. My tone carried the heavy, unyielding weight of a man who spent 40 years commanding salvage crews on the open ocean. The foreman froze in his tracks, looking nervously between me and Megan. "I am the legal owner of this property," I continued, stepping directly into the center of the room. "You are trespassing. If you do not drop my belongings and exit my house in the next 10 seconds, I will have every single one of you arrested for breaking and entering." Megan scoffed, taking another sip from my chipped mug. "Do not listen to him," she snapped at the crew. "My husband holds the power of attorney. I am authorizing this." The movers hesitated, caught in the crossfire. I stepped closer to the foreman, cutting the physical distance between us. "She is lying to you," I stated with absolute clarity. "Whatever fake paperwork she showed you will not keep you out of a jail cell when the police arrive. Drop the boxes now." The foreman read the cold reality in my eyes. He set the photographs carefully on the floor and signaled his men. Within seconds, the entire crew abandoned their packing tape and hurried out the front door, leaving it wide open. The heavy truck engine roared to life and they sped away down the street. Megan watched them leave completely unbothered. She threw her head back and let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She placed my mug heavily on the mantelpiece, shaking her head. "You are just making this harder on yourself, old man," she sneered. "You cannot stop the inevitable." Megan genuinely believed I was nothing but a broke, stubborn mechanic clinging to a dying boat shop and a worthless residential lot. She looked around my modest living room with pure disgust, seeing only faded wallpaper and worn-out floorboards. She had absolutely no idea that keeping this house simple was a deliberate choice. When my late wife and I started making real money, we made a pact. We decided never to let wealth define our character or our lifestyle. We funneled our massive profits into offshore accounts, untouchable trusts, and commercial real estate. We lived quietly, honoring the working-class roots that shaped us. Aaron grew up resenting this humility. When he married Megan, he found a partner who worshipped status above all else. She married him because he projected the image of a rising corporate star, completely unaware that his entire lifestyle was secretly funded by the very father she now despised. She looked at my grease-stained hands and my faded flannel coat and saw a helpless victim. She thought this brick house was the entirety of my net worth. She believed seizing this property and liquidating my old checking account would render me completely destitute. She was attacking a fortress, thinking it was a fragile wooden shack. I let her relish her false sense of superiority. I watched her wipe a speck of dust from her expensive coat, entirely confident in her victory. I knew the deadliest weapon in any war is the element of surprise. Let her think I was a broken old man holding onto garbage. Her blinding arrogance was preventing her from seeing the massive, catastrophic trap she was walking directly into. She had no idea the financial empire she was trying to steal was built to withstand hurricanes. Megan reached into her designer bag and pulled out a glossy trifold brochure. She tossed it onto the coffee table. It landed right next to the packing tape the movers had abandoned. "Read it," she demanded. I glanced down. The bold letters across the front read Shady Pines Assisted Living. It was a notoriously underfunded state-run memory care facility on the grim outskirts of the city. It was a place where forgotten people were sent to fade away in sterile, locked corridors. "Aaron and I have already secured your bed," Megan announced, crossing her arms tightly. "Your bags need to be packed by tomorrow morning. A court-appointed psychiatrist is arriving here precisely at noon." She stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with absolute malice. "He is coming to conduct your final evaluation and sign the official medical commitment papers. Once he signs, the state takes over. You will be legally classified as a danger to yourself." I kept my posture perfectly rigid, betraying no emotion whatsoever. "I am not going anywhere," I replied evenly. Megan smiled, a cruel and predatory expression stretching across her face. "You do not have a choice, Simon. The paperwork is already in motion. If you try to argue with the doctor, it will only prove you are mentally unstable. If you refuse to go quietly, the court will send orderlies to remove you by physical force. You can walk out that door voluntarily, or you can be dragged out in a chemical restraint." She turned and walked toward the exit, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. "See you at noon tomorrow," she called out over her shoulder. The door slammed shut. I was entirely alone in my half-dismantled house with less than 24 hours to dismantle their entire conspiracy. The heavy oak door slammed shut, vibrating the framed photograph still resting against the wall. I did not move until I heard the aggressive roar of Megan's luxury SUV speeding out of my driveway. I stood in the middle of my half-dismantled living room, the silence settling around me like fine dust. I had exactly 24 hours before a corrupt psychiatrist arrived to strip away my fundamental human rights. I walked down the narrow hallway to my master bedroom. The movers had already stripped the sheets from the mattress, leaving the room feeling cold and hollow. I stepped into the walk-in closet and knelt on the worn hardwood. I counted 3 boards from the left wall and pressed my thumbs against a seemingly invisible seam. The heavy oak plank popped upward, releasing a quiet hiss of pressurized air. Beneath the floorboards sat a digital fireproof steel safe. I punched in a 12-digit code, a sequence known only to me and my late wife. The heavy locking mechanism clicked open. I reached inside and bypassed a stack of physical documents, reaching instead for a thick-banded stack of untraceable cash and a cheap, unlisted burner phone. Aaron thought he had paralyzed me by freezing my primary checking account. He failed to realize that a man who spent 40 years pulling wreckage from the bottom of the Atlantic never relies on a single lifeline. I powered on the burner phone. The digital screen illuminated the dark closet. I needed a weapon that could not be tracked by the power of attorney my son had so arrogantly forged. I slipped the cash into my jacket pocket and dialed a number I had memorized over 2 decades ago. The line rang exactly twice before a sharp, hyper-alert voice answered. Bradley did not use casual greetings. He was a ruthless, high-tier corporate attorney who dealt exclusively in aggressive acquisitions and hostile corporate defense. He was a shark in a tailored suit, and I had kept him on a silent retainer for over 20 years for exactly this kind of emergency. I told him my accounts were frozen, my house was under siege, and my son was attempting a medical coup. Bradley did not waste a single breath offering meaningless sympathy. He simply asked for my current location and operational status. I told him I was mobile and untracked. We agreed to meet immediately at an old neon-lit diner 20 miles outside the city limits, far beyond the reach of Megan's immediate social circle or Aaron's corporate spies. I left my compromised smartphone sitting on the kitchen counter, ensuring Aaron would think I was still paralyzed inside the house. I climbed back into my rusted Chevy and navigated the back roads out of town. The rain began to fall in heavy, rhythmic sheets, washing the salt and grime from the windshield. I pulled into the diner parking lot 30 minutes later. Bradley was already sitting in a back corner booth nursing a cup of black coffee. He looked entirely out of place in his pristine charcoal suit against the cracked vinyl seating. I slid into the booth across from him and dropped the burner phone on the table. "They are trying to lock me in a state-run memory care ward by tomorrow afternoon," I stated plainly. Bradley took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute predatory focus. Bradley was one of the very few people on Earth who knew the actual scale of my financial footprint. Aaron and Megan genuinely believed my entire net worth was tied to a dying salvage yard and a modest brick house. They viewed me as an outdated mechanic drowning in grease and nostalgia. Bradley knew the reality. During the devastating financial crash of 2008, while other businesses were panicking and liquidating their assets for pennies, my late wife and I made a calculated, massive gamble. We took decades of quietly accumulated maritime salvage profits and aggressively purchased the commercial deeds to the entire surrounding waterfront district. We bought up defaulting warehouses, failing dry docks, and abandoned commercial lots. We consolidated it all under a deeply buried blind trust that Bradley managed in absolute secrecy. The rusted fences and old boats of my salvage yard were nothing but a functional facade. The actual dirt sitting beneath those old tires was prime, unencumbered commercial real estate currently valued at over $50 million. Aaron was trying to steal a rusty crown, completely oblivious to the kingdom buried directly beneath his feet. Bradley opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a secure encrypted tablet. He did not ask how I was feeling. He knew I did not want pity. I wanted a targeted, overwhelming counteroffensive. "I paid you a premium retainer for 2 decades precisely, so we would be ready when the vultures started circling," I told him. Bradley typed a rapid sequence of commands into his tablet. "The vultures are not just circling, Simon," he replied, his voice dropping an octave. "They have already landed, and they are currently ripping into the primary collateral." Bradley spun the tablet around so I could view the heavily encrypted financial documents. "While you were driving here, I ran a deep-level background check on the commercial loan your son is attempting to finalize," Bradley explained. "Aaron and Megan are purchasing a luxury real estate development firm. To secure the massive bridge loan required for the acquisition, they needed to provide the bank with an extraordinary amount of physical equity." I stared at the digital ledger, my eyes tracking the transaction codes. "They used my stolen checking account funds to cover the initial escrow deposit," I noted. "But $90,000 is not nearly enough to secure a loan of that magnitude." Bradley nodded grimly, tapping a specific line on the screen. "Exactly. That is why Aaron used the forged power of attorney to leverage the entire marina. He officially listed the physical salvage yard and the underlying waterfront property as the primary collateral for his corporate debt." A cold, heavy knot formed directly in the center of my chest. If Aaron's new development firm failed to turn an immediate profit, or if he missed even a single quarterly payment on that massive bridge loan, the commercial bank would legally foreclose on the property. They would seize the docks, the warehouses, and the legacy I had spent 40 years building with my own bare hands. Aaron was not just stealing my money. He was gambling my entire life's work on a high-risk corporate acquisition he lacked the discipline to actually manage. "We have less than 24 hours before that loan permanently clears processing," Bradley stated, his tone razor-sharp. "If we do not intercept this capital transfer immediately, your son will effectively hand $50 million of your real estate to a commercial bank." I looked at the digital ledger glowing on Bradley's encrypted tablet. Aaron and Megan were leveraging my entire life's work to purchase Sterling Horizons Group. They firmly believed the commercial bank held the ultimate power over this transaction. I needed to shift the balance of power entirely into my own hands before the sun went down. I looked Bradley directly in the eyes across the cracked vinyl table of the diner. "I do not want to merely block this fraudulent bridge loan," I stated firmly, keeping my voice low against the hum of the diner. "I want to own the actual battlefield they are fighting on." Contact the primary holding company that currently owns Sterling Horizons. Find out exactly who holds their corporate debt. Bradley raised a single eyebrow, his sharp legal mind instantly catching up to my strategy. You want to buy their debt. Bradley confirmed, his tone shifting into pure predatory focus. If I purchase the overarching debt of the development firm, I effectively become the ultimate creditor, I explained. Aaron is using my stolen checking account funds to buy a company. I will simply buy the company he is trying to acquire. I will own his debt, which means I will own him. Bradley typed a rapid sequence of commands into his tablet, bypassing corporate firewalls with practiced ruthless efficiency. Give me 10 minutes, he said, his fingers flying across the glass screen. I will find out exactly who holds the paper on Sterling Horizons and initiate a silent buyout through your offshore blind trust. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. The bitter taste grounded me. Aaron thought he had boxed an old man into a corner. He was about to find out that I owned the entire building. Bradley did not take 10 minutes. He found the raw financial data in 6. His posture stiffened significantly as he pulled up a new set of encrypted federal banking records. Simon, we have a massive escalation, Bradley announced, turning the tablet back toward me. Look at the asset declaration Aaron submitted to the commercial bank to secure this bridge loan. I leaned forward and scanned the lines of the digital document. Aaron had listed the physical inventory of my marine salvage yard as liquid collateral, but the numbers printed next to my rusted cranes, broken engine blocks, and salvaged steel were completely fabricated. He listed a graveyard of scrapped fishing boats as a fleet of operational commercial vessels. He valued heaps of rusted iron as pristine maritime construction materials. He artificially inflated the appraisal of the scrapyard by over $10 million. He lied to a federal lending institution, I stated, feeling a cold, heavy knot of realization form directly in my stomach. Bradley nodded grimly, tapping the screen. This is not just a localized family dispute anymore, Simon. Submitting fraudulent appraisals to secure a commercial loan across state lines constitutes federal wire fraud. Aaron has committed a massive, undeniable felony. If the bank sends an inspector to the marina and discovers the inventory is nothing but rusted scrap, they will immediately trigger a default. They will seize the land to cover their losses. Aaron had blindly strapped a ticking explosive to my legacy. He was risking a $50 million piece of waterfront real estate on a desperate lie he could never defend. He was willing to destroy 40 years of my blood and sweat just to appease his greedy wife. I stared at the fraudulent numbers glowing on the screen. The sheer breathtaking laziness of his crime did not surprise me. Aaron had never respected the difficult, gritty reality of building genuine value. My mind drifted back 30 years to a sweltering July afternoon at the marina. Aaron was 10 years old. I stood him in front of a dismantled outboard motor, handing him a grease-covered wrench. I wanted to teach him the absolute satisfaction of fixing something broken with his own 2 hands. I showed him how to clean the carburetor and align the metal pistons. 10 minutes into the lesson, the wrench slipped. A thick glob of black engine oil splattered directly onto his brand new expensive white sneakers. Aaron threw the wrench onto the hard concrete floor. He screamed, entirely furious about his ruined shoes, and stormed out of the garage. He never stepped foot in my workshop again. He spent the rest of his life actively avoiding dirty hands, constantly seeking the fastest, cleanest shortcut to unearned success. He married Megan because she offered a pristine, polished image of corporate wealth. He forged my signature and fabricated federal loan documents because he fundamentally believed the rules of hard work did not apply to him. He wanted the heavy crown of a king, but he was entirely unwilling to forge the steel required to earn it. Now, his lifelong obsession with shortcuts was going to cost him his freedom. I took a deep breath, locking my emotions away into a dark vault. I could not afford to mourn the son I wished I had. I had to utterly destroy the criminal sitting in his place. The diner bell chimed sharply, cutting through my thoughts. I looked toward the front entrance. Aaron stood in the doorway, his expensive tailored suit completely soaked from the freezing rain. His eyes scanned the cracked vinyl booths until they locked onto me. He marched across the diner floor, his face flushed with pure, arrogant rage. He did not even acknowledge Bradley sitting quietly across from me. Aaron slammed his hand flat onto our table, rattling the coffee cups violently. "Hand over the keys to the residential house right now," Aaron demanded, his voice echoing loudly across the quiet room. "I tracked the GPS beacon Megan installed on your truck. You have no right to leave the property without our permission." I looked up at my son. His chest heaved with manufactured pathetic authority. "I am having coffee with an old friend," I said evenly, not moving a single muscle. "I do not need your permission to exist." Aaron pulled his cell phone from his jacket pocket, holding it up like a loaded weapon. "The medical hold is active, Simon. You are a legal ward of my estate. If you do not hand over those keys and walk out to my car this exact second, I am calling the local police. I will report a confused, wandering senior citizen who has stolen a vehicle and poses a critical danger to the public. They will drag you back to the house in handcuffs, and I will have you committed to the locked memory care ward tonight instead of tomorrow." He stood there, fully prepared to destroy my dignity in a crowded room to secure his stolen wealth. I looked at Aaron standing in the diner, attempting to weaponize my age to secure his stolen wealth. I did not flinch. I told him to call the police right now. I invited him to explain to armed officers why a perfectly lucid man drinking black coffee with his corporate attorney needed to be handcuffed and dragged away. Aaron hesitated. Bullies always crumble when you strip away their captive audience and confront them with actual consequences. He lowered his phone, realizing a public spectacle would expose his fragile narrative to unwanted scrutiny. He sneered, promising me the court-appointed doctor would finish the job tomorrow, and stormed out into the freezing rain. The following morning at exactly noon, a silver Mercedes pulled into my driveway. Dr. Eris Thorne stepped out of the luxury vehicle. He did not look like a dedicated medical professional. He wore a tailored Italian suit and a heavy gold watch that cost more than a standard salvage boat engine. He walked into my living room without knocking, carrying a slim leather briefcase. He reeked of expensive cologne and absolute arrogance. He sat on my sofa, crossed his legs, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He did not ask how I was feeling today. He did not check my vitals. He immediately launched into a series of deeply insulting leading questions. He asked if I frequently forgot my own name. He asked if the kitchen appliances confused me. He spoke slowly, articulating every single syllable as if he were addressing a toddler. He was clearly operating directly on Megan's payroll, tasked with building a fabricated psychological profile to justify my permanent lockup in a state facility. I did not correct his insulting tone. I slumped my shoulders and let my gaze drift aimlessly around the room. I offered him exactly what he was paid to find. I hesitated for long, agonizing seconds before answering his questions. I intentionally misidentified the current day of the week, claiming it was Sunday instead of Wednesday. When he asked me to count backward from 100, I stopped at 80 and pretended to lose my train of thought, staring blankly at the wall. Dr. Thorne smiled. It was a slick, victorious smirk that betrayed his utter lack of medical ethics. He scribbled rapidly on his notepad, entirely confident in his superiority. He had absolutely no idea that a high-definition digital voice recorder was currently taped securely to the underside of the coffee table, positioned mere inches from his expensive leather shoes. The device was actively capturing every single leading question, every condescending remark, and every blatant violation of the law. I was essentially dictating his own professional ruin and future prison sentence directly into my microphone. He leaned forward and asked if I ever felt violent urges toward my family members. I replied with a shaky, whispered apology, claiming I just wanted to be left alone in the dark. He nodded, marking a final check on his official form. He told me it was completely normal for a man of my advanced cognitive decline to feel overwhelmed by simple reality. He was constructing a perfect, airtight cage made of medical jargon, sealing my fate with every stroke of his silver pen. I watched him write, feeling a familiar, cold patience settle deep in my bones. Enduring this pathetic charade was completely effortless compared to what I had survived in the past. My mind flashed back to the brutal Atlantic winters of the 1980s. Back then, I was running a skeleton salvage crew on a rusted, flat-bottomed barge. We got caught in a massive, unpredicted storm system off the coast. The waves were towering walls of freezing black water. The wind screamed like tearing metal, threatening to rip the cabin right off the deck. A lesser captain would have panicked, pushed the throttle to the maximum, and tried to outrun the gale, ultimately destroying the engine and sinking the ship. I knew the only way to survive a storm of that immense magnitude was to cut the throttle point, the bow, directly into the breaking waves and let the tempest exhaust itself against the reinforced hull. You do not fight the hurricane. You simply outlast it. Dr. Thorne was just another storm. He was a noisy, arrogant gust of wind trying to capsize my life. I sat completely still, pointing my bow directly into his lies. I allowed him to expend all his energy building this false medical narrative. I knew that the heavier the documentation he created, the harder the federal fraud charges would hit him when I finally dropped the anchor. He closed his leather folder with a sharp, satisfied snap. He stood up, smoothing his designer tie. He announced that the evaluation was complete and he would submit his final recommendation to the state authorities by 5 o'clock. Dr. Thorne did not immediately walk to his luxury car. He stepped out onto my front porch and pulled his sleek smartphone from his jacket pocket. He pulled the front door shut behind him, assuming he was in complete privacy. He failed to notice the small matte black security camera mounted directly beneath the wooden eaves of the roof. I had installed the high-definition audio-visual system 3 years ago after a string of neighborhood burglaries. I walked quietly into my kitchen and pulled out the untraceable burner phone. I opened the live security feed application. Thorne was pacing the length of my porch. I watched him dial a number and press the phone to his ear. I turned the volume up to the maximum level. Megan's sharp, impatient voice echoed faintly through the digital feed. Thorne did not waste time with professional pleasantries. He told her the evaluation was flawlessly executed and that I was officially documented as a severe liability incapable of independent living. Then his tone shifted from medical authority to raw, unfiltered greed. He demanded the remaining $10,000 of his agreed-upon bribe immediately. He explicitly stated he would not file the commitment papers with the court until the wire transfer cleared his offshore bank account. He threatened to shred the evaluation entirely if Megan delayed the payment by even a single hour. I saved the video clip directly to the secure drive on the burner phone. The medical hold was not just unethical, it was a verifiable, documented extortion racket. Before I could send the footage to Bradley, my phone vibrated with an incoming text from my attorney. The message contained a single chilling sentence. Megan just filed an expedited motion to legally evict you from the property in exactly 7 days, claiming the house is a critical biohazard. I read Bradley's text message glowing brightly on the screen of my secure burner phone. Megan had just filed an expedited legal motion to aggressively evict me from my own home in exactly 7 days. She falsely labeled my property a critical biohazard to bypass standard tenancy laws and force an immediate removal. I did not text him back. Panic is exactly what they wanted to provoke. I pocketed the phone, stepped out onto my front porch, and drove my rusted Chevy pickup straight toward the financial district. I met Bradley on the 42nd floor of a private wealth management firm that catered exclusively to ultra-high net worth commercial clients. The sleek mahogany walls and silent, heavily guarded corridors were a world away from my greasy salvage yard, but the ruthless predators operating here hunted exactly like the sharks in the deep Atlantic. We sat in a soundproof boardroom overlooking the sprawling city skyline. A senior portfolio manager slid a thick stack of embossed legal contracts across the polished glass table. Bradley nodded to me silently, signaling that the paperwork was absolutely flawless. I pulled a heavy fountain pen from my coat pocket. By signing these documents, I authorized the immediate release of massive funds from my offshore blind trust. I was not buying a new property or a traditional asset. I was purchasing the overarching corporate debt of Sterling Horizons Group. This was the exact luxury real estate development firm my son was desperately trying to acquire. Aaron genuinely thought he was buying a highly lucrative company using my stolen checking account funds as his down payment. He did not realize the company he was purchasing was drowning in toxic commercial debt. I signed my name precisely on the bottom line. The portfolio manager stamped the documents officially transferring the debt portfolio directly into my holding corporation. The silent trap was flawlessly set. The ink on the heavy paper fundamentally shifted the entire balance of power in a single stroke. Bradley closed the leather binder with a satisfying, decisive thud. By purchasing this distressed debt portfolio, I had effectively become Aaron's absolute primary creditor. My son was currently borrowing massive amounts of commercial capital using a forged deed on my marina as his physical collateral, all to buy a sprawling corporate entity. But the staggering amount of money he was borrowing to acquire that company would now be owed directly to me. I owned the unyielding paper on Sterling Horizons. If Aaron missed a single payment, breached any operational covenant of the acquisition, or failed to clear his initial bridge loan, I possessed the unilateral legal authority to liquidate the firm entirely. He was unknowingly financing his own hostile takeover, and I held the ultimate detonator. Aaron believed he was rapidly ascending to the absolute pinnacle of the city's commercial real estate market. He thought he had brilliantly outsmarted his uneducated blue-collar father. He was completely oblivious to the fact that he had just placed his entire corporate future, his personal freedom, and his stolen assets directly into the palm of my calloused hand. I did not just block his fraudulent loan. I built an inescapable steel cage around his entire financial existence. Bradley leaned back in his expensive leather chair, a cold, predatory smile forming on his face. He confirmed that the commercial bank processing Aaron's bridge loan would finalize their mandatory paperwork by Friday afternoon. The very moment the bank cleared those massive funds, Aaron would be officially locked into the rigid debt structure I now controlled in secret. The arrogant hunter had officially become the trapped prey. I stepped closer to the glass and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling waterfront far below. My son never understood how I actually built my massive fortune. He looked at the rusted industrial cranes and oil-stained docks of the marina and saw nothing but dirty, low-class manual labor. He failed to comprehend that marine salvage is fundamentally the brutal business of acquiring catastrophic failure and engineering it into massive profit. 40 years ago, I started buying sunken commercial trawlers and abandoned cargo barges that the massive insurance companies had entirely written off as total losses. I bought their terrible bad debt for pennies on the dollar. I hauled the heavy wrecks from the deep mud, stripped the ruined diesel engines, rebuilt the cracked hulls with reinforced steel, and sold them back to the wealthy shipping conglomerates for a massive premium. I took the absolute worst disasters the ocean could produce and turned them into cold, hard capital. Now I was applying those exact same brutal salvage mechanics to corporate warfare. Aaron had manufactured a disastrous financial wreck. He was recklessly sinking his entire future into a highly leveraged, toxic acquisition. Instead of throwing him a desperate life preserver, I bought the sinking ship out from under him. I knew exactly how to strip a ruined vessel down to its bare bolts. I was fully prepared to dismantle my son's fraudulent empire piece by piece until he was left with absolutely nothing but the bitter, crushing reality of his own greed. The ocean never forgives weakness or incompetence, and neither does the open market. I turned away from the towering window, fully ready to execute the next phase of our counteroffensive. Bradley cleared his throat, his professional expression suddenly darkening with urgent concern. He pulled a freshly printed webpage from his briefcase and slid it quickly across the table. "The legal maneuver we just executed secures our endgame," Bradley stated sharply. "But Megan is drastically accelerating her timeline on the ground. She is not waiting for the fabricated eviction notice to process through the courts next week." I looked down at the colorful printout. It was a digital advertisement for an exclusive high-end estate sale scheduled for this coming Saturday morning at my exact residential address. Megan had prominently listed my late wife's beloved antique furniture alongside my most valuable vintage marine navigational equipment. She was openly advertising my private possessions to the highest bidder without a shred of legal authority. Bradley tapped the paper aggressively. My investigator tracked her recent personal credit activity. Megan completely maxed out her designer credit lines yesterday afternoon, buying luxury garments for the massive launch party she is hosting this weekend. She scheduled this illegal estate sale to immediately liquidate your physical assets into untraceable cash to cover her personal shopping sprees. She plans to strip your house down to the copper wiring before the local police can even enforce her fraudulent eviction notice. The sheer audacity of her unchecked greed was absolutely staggering. She was bringing strangers into my home to sell the cherished memories of my dead wife just to fund her shallow vanity. I picked up the paper, folding it neatly into a tight square. I thanked Bradley for his relentless diligence. I walked out of the corporate tower and back to my truck. If Megan wanted to sell my history to the highest bidder, I was going to ensure she met a buyer who demanded a very steep price. The freezing rain from the previous day had given way to a bitter, biting coastal wind by Thursday morning. I was back at the salvage yard, standing inside the corrugated steel bay of the main workshop. The heavy scent of oxidized iron and marine diesel filled my lungs. I was wiping down a refurbished alternator when a caravan of sleek black luxury sedans crunched onto the gravel lot. They parked haphazardly, entirely blocking the loading ramps my crew needed for the morning haul. The doors opened in unison. Megan stepped out of the lead vehicle. She was dressed in a pristine, tailored white pantsuit that looked entirely absurd against the backdrop of rusted cranes and muddy tire tracks. She was followed closely by 4 men carrying digital clipboards and laser measuring devices. They were commercial property appraisers. Megan did not walk into my salvage yard. She strutted into it like a conquering general surveying a newly captured territory. I stood in the shadows of the workshop bay and watched her operate. She pointed a manicured finger toward the primary dry docks where my men were actively welding a damaged hull. She told the appraisers to mark that entire sector for immediate demolition. She gestured toward the main administrative building, loudly explaining how it would be bulldozed to make way for a luxury glass front sales office. She was completely stripping the humanity and the history from the ground I had purchased 40 years ago. She treated the massive steel lifters and the heavy cargo ships as nothing more than temporary garbage cluttering her future real estate empire. The appraisers scurried around her like obedient servants, aiming their lasers and taking rapid photographs of the property lines. Hector appeared beside me in the dim light of the workshop bay. His thick, calloused hands were gripped tightly around a massive, solid steel pipe wrench. The veins in his thick neck bulged against his grease-stained collar. He stared out at the appraisers swarming our docks, his chest heaving with deep, barely contained fury. "Boss, give me the word," Hector growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble over the sound of the ocean wind. "Give me the green light, and I will throw every single one of those suits straight off the end of the pier. I will drag her white truck out of our lot with the heavy forklift. They have absolutely no right to be here." I reached out and placed a firm, steady hand on Hector's broad shoulder. I felt the raw tension vibrating through his muscles. "Put the wrench down, Hector," I commanded, keeping my tone perfectly even and absolutely unyielding. "We are not going to touch them. We are going to let them measure every single inch of this property. We are going to let them take their photographs and build their fraudulent commercial numbers." Hector looked at me, his dark eyes flashing with fierce confusion and defensive anger. "But they are treating you like you are already dead," he protested. I squeezed his shoulder once firmly. "If we fight them with our fists, we give them the exact narrative they desperately need," I explained quietly. "Megan wants me to act like a violent, erratic, senile old man. She wants an excuse to call the police and execute that medical hold today. Violence is exactly what she is hunting for. Silence is our best weapon right now. Let her dig the hole as deep as she possibly can." Hector stared at my face for a long, heavy moment. He slowly lowered the heavy steel wrench until it rested against his thigh. He had worked by my side for over 30 years. We met when he was just a desperate, angry 19-year-old kid looking for a second chance after a bad stint in the juvenile system. Nobody in the city would hire him. I handed him a pair of heavy work gloves and told him to start pulling rusted copper wire from a sunken trawler. He never left. He built a family, a home, and a deeply honorable life on these exact docks. He was infinitely more of a son to me than Aaron had ever been. Hector knew my mind better than anyone else alive. Over the past 3 decades, he had watched me navigate brutal recessions, vicious union disputes, and corrupt city inspectors. He had seen me outmaneuver ruthless shipping executives who tried to bankrupt us. He knew I never yelled when I was angry. He knew that when I went completely quiet, it meant a catastrophic trap was about to snap shut on whoever was foolish enough to threaten our livelihood. He looked back out at Megan, who was currently yelling at an appraiser to hurry up with his calculations. Hector took a deep breath, letting the blinding anger recede into a cold, professional discipline. He nodded once, acknowledging my absolute authority. "I trust you, boss," Hector said softly. He stepped backward, fading into the dark shadows of the workshop, blending seamlessly into the heavy machinery. He would not interfere, but he would not let me out of his sight. We stood together in the darkness, watching the intruders operate on our land. The lead appraiser finished his digital calculations and walked quickly over to Megan. He handed her his electronic tablet. Megan snatched the device from his hands and reviewed the preliminary numbers glowing on the screen. Her triumphant smirk instantly vanished. Her face contorted into an ugly, furious scowl. She tapped the glass screen aggressively. "This valuation is completely unacceptable," she shouted, making absolutely no effort to lower her voice. "This land is waterfront property. It should be valued at triple this amount." The lead appraiser adjusted his glasses nervously. "Ma'am, the physical dirt is highly valuable," he explained cautiously. "But this is currently an active commercial salvage operation. The operational liabilities are massively dragging down your net valuation. You have a massive, fully unionized payroll, heavy equipment maintenance costs, and significant maritime insurance premiums. The bank has to factor in those heavy financial liabilities when calculating the maximum bridge loan for your new development firm." Megan glared at the man as if he had just insulted her personally. She pulled her smartphone from her pocket and dialed Aaron on speakerphone. "Aaron, the bank is undervaluing the collateral because of the salvage yard's operational costs," she snapped into the receiver. "I am fixing it right now." Megan turned back to the appraiser with a cold, ruthless smile. "The operational liabilities are no longer a problem," she announced loudly. "Effective tomorrow morning, I am using my legal power of attorney to completely freeze the employee payroll account. None of these mechanics are getting paid. You can report to the commercial bank that our profit margins just skyrocketed because we eliminated our entire labor cost. She was willing to starve my men and destroy their families just to artificially inflate her fraudulent balance sheet." The war had just crossed a devastating new line. The coastal wind howled off the water on Friday morning, bringing with it a bitter chill that seeped right through the corrugated steel walls of the main workshop. I arrived at the salvage yard at 6 in the morning, long before the sun had fully crested over the Atlantic. My crew was already gathered in the concrete break room, but the usual sounds of scraping chairs and loud, rough laughter were completely absent. Instead, a heavy, suffocating tension filled the air. Hector stood at the center of the room, surrounded by 20 of my most hardened mechanics, welders, and heavy machinery operators. Several men were gripping their smartphones, staring furiously at their banking applications. Hector looked up as I walked through the metal door. His face was a mask of cold, restrained panic. "Boss, the direct deposits did not clear," Hector announced. His voice was tight. Every single paycheck bounced at midnight. "The bank is telling the men that the primary commercial payroll account has been unilaterally frozen by the estate administrator." Megan had actually followed through on her catastrophic threat. to artificially inflate the salvage yard's profit margins for her fraudulent commercial loan application. She had maliciously stopped the wages of men who relied on that money to feed their children. She did not see human beings sweating over rusted steel. She only saw disposable numbers on a balance sheet that she could erase to impress a team of corporate investors. The men looked at me, their faces a mix of desperation and brewing anger. These were men who lived paycheck to paycheck, supporting families in a harsh economy. A single missed payment meant overdue rent, empty refrigerators, and immediate crisis. Megan wanted them to strike or walk out, crippling the yard so she could justify liquidating it entirely. I did not offer them empty corporate platitudes. I did not tell them to wait for the legal system to sort out the banking freeze. I turned to Hector and told him to gather the entire crew at my residential house in exactly 1 hour. I drove back to my modest brick home, ignoring the fake eviction notice Megan had illegally taped to my front door. I walked straight to my bedroom closet, knelt on the hardwood, and popped the hidden floorboard. I opened the fireproof steel safe and pulled out thick, heavy stacks of $100 bills bound tightly in Federal Reserve bands. I placed the cash into a heavy canvas duffel bag. When I returned to my kitchen, 20 marine salvage workers were crowding my driveway. I invited them inside, directing them to form a single line through my living room. I set the canvas bag on my dining table and unzipped it. I called out each man's name one by one. I looked them directly in the eyes, counted out their exact weekly wages in crisp $100 bills, and handed the money directly into their calloused hands. I added an extra $500 to every single payout to cover any overdraft fees Megan's malicious freeze might have caused them. The men were absolutely stunned. They took the cash with quiet, profound gratitude. Hector stood by the door, watching the entire process with a fiercely loyal gleam in his dark eyes. I was not just paying my men. I was cementing an unbreakable wall of loyalty that Aaron and Megan's stolen money could never possibly penetrate. By the time the last mechanic walked out the door, the canvas bag was significantly lighter, but my salvage crew was entirely secure. Handing out that physical cash transported my mind back to the brutal economic crash of 2008. When the shipping industry collapsed overnight, major corporations were laying off thousands of workers without a second thought. Entire dockyards went completely bankrupt, leaving honest men drowning in sudden poverty. I refused to let that happen to my crew. During the absolute darkest months of that recession, I secretly leveraged my own retirement funds to ensure the marina's payroll never missed a single Friday. I ate rice and beans in this exact kitchen while making certain my men could put meat on their tables. You do not abandon the people who build your empire when the weather turns bad. That was the fundamental difference between my son and me. Aaron attended business seminars where slick professors taught him that employees were nothing but operational liabilities to be mitigated. He believed true power came from stepping on the necks of the working class to elevate his own pristine corporate status. He married a woman who shared that exact same toxic philosophy. They looked at a frozen bank account and saw a brilliant, calculated business strategy to impress federal lenders. I looked at a frozen bank account and saw a direct, unforgivable assault on the families under my protection. Aaron thought freezing the payroll would spark a massive walkout, rendering the marina empty and ready for immediate demolition. He completely underestimated the fact that my men did not work for a bank account. They worked for me, and I had just proven with cold hard cash that I would go to war to protect their livelihoods. I was zipping up the empty canvas bag when my untraceable burner phone vibrated sharply in my coat pocket. I checked the encrypted caller identification. It was Bradley, my attorney, routing a call directly from Aaron's personal number to protect my location. I answered the phone and held it to my ear. Aaron did not say hello. He screamed into the receiver with a frantic, unhinged fury. "What the hell did you just do?" Aaron shouted, his voice echoing loudly across the line. "The bank manager just called me. The salvage crew deposited $20,000 in physical cash across town this morning. You completely undermined my legal authority. You are actively sabotaging my commercial loan approval." I kept my voice perfectly flat, offering absolutely no emotion for him to feed on. "I paid my men," I replied evenly. "You tried to starve them. I ensured their families will eat this weekend." "You are a severely confused, delusional old man," Aaron snapped, his panic bleeding through his aggressive tone. "I hold the power of attorney. I am the sole legal administrator of that marina. By paying those men, you are operating an illegal rogue financial enterprise on my property. This is your final warning, Simon. If you step one single foot onto the marina docks on Monday morning, I will not just call the police for trespassing. I will have you physically detained by private security and dragged to the locked psychiatric ward by force. You are entirely out of time." He slammed the phone down, severing the connection. I lowered the burner phone. Aaron was completely unhinged, terrified that his fragile corporate narrative was cracking. He promised to lock me in a cage on Monday. He had no idea that by Saturday night his entire stolen empire would cease to exist. I stood in my quiet kitchen holding the silent burner phone. Aaron's unhinged threats of locking me in a psychiatric ward still echoed in the room. I immediately dialed Bradley and recounted the conversation, focusing strictly on the escalating timeline. Bradley did not waste a single second offering empty reassurances. He demanded the raw video file from my hidden porch camera. I transmitted the encrypted footage of Dr. Thorne demanding his $10,000 bribe directly to Bradley's secure server. Within 10 minutes, Bradley activated a private investigator specializing in forensic financial tracking. This was not a standard background check. Bradley's contact was a former federal auditor who treated digital money trails like glowing footprints in fresh snow. His explicit directive was to locate the exact origin of the $10,000 wire transfer that Thorne had demanded from Megan to finalize the fraudulent medical commitment papers. We needed irrefutable documented proof of a federal felony. We needed the exact transaction ID, the timestamps, and the originating bank routing numbers. If Thorne was foolish enough to demand a bribe over an open cell phone line on a residential porch, he was definitely arrogant enough to accept the payment through a traceable banking channel. The investigator tapped into offshore banking registries and domestic wire clearinghouses, hunting for the specific monetary anomaly. I sat at my dining table, the empty canvas bag from the morning payroll still resting on the wood, and waited for the digital trap to snap shut. The silence in the house was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. I knew this single piece of financial evidence would completely dismantle their entire psychiatric narrative. We were no longer just defending my assets. We were actively building a criminal indictment. The encrypted burner phone vibrated aggressively precisely 3 hours later. Bradley sent a secure password-protected document containing the investigator's finalized report. I opened the file and stared at the highlighted financial data glowing on the small screen. The private investigator had flawlessly intercepted the digital ledger of the wire transfer. Dr. Thorne had indeed received exactly $10,000 into a thinly veiled shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. But the destination of the bribe was completely irrelevant compared to its origin. The investigator secured the exact routing and account numbers that initiated the illicit transfer. I zoomed in on the document. The money did not originate from Megan's personal shopping accounts or a hidden, untraceable trust fund. The massive wire transfer was initiated directly from the primary joint checking account registered to both Megan and Aaron. There was a secondary digital signature required for transfers exceeding $5,000 on that specific account. Aaron had personally authorized the transaction from his own mobile device. The digital footprint was absolute and completely undeniable. Aaron was not just turning a blind eye to his wife's malicious scheming. He was actively funding the illegal extortion racket to have his own father permanently locked inside a locked medical facility. He had personally clicked the button to pay the corrupt doctor who fabricated my severe cognitive decline. The evidence proved premeditated medical fraud conspiracy and federal wire fraud, with Aaron serving as a fully complicit co-conspirator. The legal firewall he thought he had built by letting Megan do the dirty work on the ground was completely obliterated. He was directly tied to the bribe. Bradley followed up the document with a brief text message confirming that this specific financial evidence guaranteed mandatory federal prison sentences for all three of them. I locked the phone screen and set it down on the table. A cold, hollow ache settled deep inside my chest, temporarily overriding the adrenaline of the investigation. For months, I had harbored a small, desperate sliver of hope regarding my son, even as I watched him forge my signature and steal my operational funds. A quiet part of my mind tried to rationalize his betrayal. I wanted to believe that Aaron was simply weak. I wanted to believe he was a foolish, easily influenced man being ruthlessly manipulated by Megan's insatiable greed. A father always wants to blame the outside world for the darkness growing inside his child. I had spent years making excuses for his sharp edges, telling myself that his aggressive corporate ambition was just a misguided attempt to prove his worth in a modern world I did not fully understand. But those routing numbers glowing on the screen systematically murdered that final fragile hope. Aaron was not a helpless victim of a toxic marriage. He was the primary architect of my destruction. He had looked at the man who sacrificed every ounce of his youth to build a secure foundation for him, and coldly calculated my exact liquidation value. He was willing to strip away my fundamental human rights and lock me in a padded cell just to secure a bridge loan for a real estate development firm. The profound losing a son was suddenly replaced by a total, absolute clarity. The man I raised was entirely gone, replaced by a ruthless corporate predator who viewed my existence as a temporary financial obstacle. I stopped being a father at that exact moment. I became a tactician preparing to completely dismantle a hostile entity. The emotional anchor was finally cut. Before I could fully process the gravity of Aaron's direct involvement, a loud, aggressive pounding echoed from my front door. I walked down the short hallway and looked through the reinforced peephole. A uniformed county sheriff's deputy was standing on my porch holding a thick stack of manila folders. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. The deputy did not offer a greeting. He simply handed me the heavy envelope, stated that I was officially served, and walked briskly back to his patrol cruiser. I stepped back inside and tore open the seal. It was an expedited legal motion filed just hours ago in the county court by Megan's high-priced legal team. She was not waiting for the fabricated psychiatric evaluation to process through the slow state medical board. She had launched a simultaneous massive legal strike to aggressively evict me from my own residential home. The paperwork claimed my house was a critical biohazard and a severe danger to the surrounding neighborhood. She had attached forged municipal inspection reports claiming severe structural rot, toxic mold infestations, and untreated chemical waste pooling in the basement. Based on these fabricated emergency health violations, a corrupt local judge had signed an emergency order giving me exactly 7 days to permanently vacate the premises. If I did not surrender the keys and abandon the property by next Friday, armed law enforcement would physically drag me into the street and bulldoze the house. Megan was attempting to strip away my physical sanctuary, leaving me entirely homeless and highly vulnerable right as the medical commitment papers went live. She wanted me sleeping in my rusted truck when the psychiatric team finally came to collect me. I tossed the fraudulent eviction notice onto the kitchen counter next to the empty canvas bag. Before the anger could fully materialize, my secure burner phone buzzed with an encrypted email alert. It was not Bradley this time. It was an automated, high-priority notification triggered directly by my primary life insurance provider. The digital letter was flagged for urgent review. I opened the secure attachment and read the fine print. Someone utilizing the forged power of attorney had initiated a massive early withdrawal request against the accumulated equity of my comprehensive whole life policy. They were attempting to cash out nearly $2 million in liquid capital. The justification for this immediate withdrawal was chilling. The application cited a catastrophic terminal illness clause supported by newly fabricated medical documents claiming I had less than 3 months to live due to rapid onset neurological failure. Megan was not just trying to evict me or lock me in a psychiatric ward anymore. She was officially classifying me as a dying man to raid the ultimate safety net I had built over 40 years. She forged hospice recommendations and attached a counterfeit physician's signature demanding the immediate transfer of the death benefit equity directly into the joint commercial account she shared with Aaron. She was actively liquidating my life while I was still breathing. The sheer velocity of their legal and financial attacks was designed to overwhelm me entirely. I read the fraudulent application twice, memorizing the fabricated diagnosis codes. They were getting increasingly sloppy, leaving massive trails of undeniable federal crimes in their desperate rush for cash. I immediately forwarded the entire insurance application package to Bradley's secure server. I did not waste time with outrage. I needed tactical precision. Within 5 minutes, Bradley was on the secure line. His voice was completely devoid of emotion, operating purely on lethal legal logic. "We are not going to cancel the policy," Bradley stated firmly. "If we aggressively flag this as a stolen identity right now, the insurance company will lock the entire account, notify the police, and tip off Aaron and Megan that we are actively watching their digital moves. Instead, we are going to use the internal bureaucratic machinery directly against them." I authorized Bradley to contact the senior fraud investigator at the insurance firm under the strict cover of an internal audit. Bradley, operating as my legally appointed private counsel, instructed the corporate investigator to place a silent administrative hold on the payout. The insurance company would send Megan an automated message stating that her massive withdrawal request was currently undergoing standard processing delays due to the high monetary value. We effectively blocked the transfer of the $2 million without raising a single red flag. More importantly, we kept the corporate fraud investigation completely open and actively compiling data. By letting Megan believe the paperwork was simply stalled in administrative limbo, she would continue to submit forged medical documents and follow-up emails, desperately trying to force the money through. Every single electronic signature and urgent email she sent to the insurance provider was automatically logged by federal regulators. We were allowing her to meticulously build her own federal wire fraud indictment, completely oblivious to the fact that she was handing Bradley the exact evidence needed to guarantee a 20-year prison sentence. I ended the call with Bradley and stared out the kitchen window at the gray, churning ocean in the distance. That life insurance policy was never intended for my personal comfort, and it certainly was never meant to line my son's pockets. When my wife was still alive, we spent countless evenings sitting on this exact porch watching the local kids fish off the rusted municipal pier. Most of those kids came from broken homes and completely underfunded schools. They had no clear path out of the brutal cycle of coastal poverty. We established that massive policy with a singular ironclad purpose. Upon my death, the entire $2 million equity was structured to immediately fund a permanent self-sustaining marine biology and maritime engineering scholarship for the underprivileged youth of this city. It was designed to send the sons and daughters of my salvage crew to top-tier universities, giving them the education to build brilliant futures far beyond the muddy docks. That money was my ultimate legacy, a promise that the wealth pulled from the ocean would be returned to the community that helped me haul it. Megan had absolutely no comprehension of legacy or community. My private investigator had already uncovered her true motivation for this specific cash grab. She had recently placed a preliminary deposit on a 70-foot luxury motor yacht currently docked in Monaco. She was literally trying to steal the college educations and future careers of dozens of working-class children just so she could sip expensive champagne on a private teak deck in the Mediterranean. She was cannibalizing the future of my community to fund her shallow, narcissistic vanity. The theft of my company was business, but the theft of that scholarship money was deeply personal. The heavy silence in the kitchen was suddenly shattered by the arrival of a sleek black courier van pulling directly into my driveway. A messenger stepped out, marched up to my front door, and taped a massive glossy envelope directly over the fake eviction notice. I retrieved the package and sliced it open. Inside was a heavy gold-embossed invitation printed on premium cardstock. Aaron had officially scheduled a massive exclusive launch gala for his new development firm, Sterling Horizons Group. The event was set for the following Saturday night, and the venue location printed on the gold card made my jaw clench. He was hosting the gala directly on the main pier of my marina. The invitation proudly announced that the city's wealthiest investors, prominent commercial bankers, and local politicians were all confirmed to attend. Aaron planned to use this extravagant party to publicly announce his successful acquisition of the waterfront property. The agenda printed on the back of the card detailed a grand midnight finale where Aaron would ceremoniously unveil the architectural blueprints for the new luxury high-rises and officially announce the immediate demolition of my salvage yard. He was bringing the absolute highest echelon of the city's financial elite to stand on my docks, drink top-shelf liquor, and celebrate the complete erasure of my life's work. He genuinely believed his bridge loan was secure, my bank accounts were drained, and my institutionalization was imminent. He was throwing a victory party on the very ground I still legally owned. I traced my calloused thumb over the gold lettering. Aaron wanted a spectacular, unforgettable launch for his new corporate empire. I decided right then that I was going to attend this gala, and I was going to give his wealthy investors a show they would never forget. I sat alone at my kitchen table on Tuesday night preparing the next phase of the operation. The launch gala was only days away, but Aaron and Megan were moving with a reckless, desperate velocity. They genuinely believed they had me cornered and isolated. It was time to give them a target too enticing to resist. I pulled a worn, leather-bound ledger from the bottom drawer of my desk. It was an old, discarded salvage log from the late 80s, filled with faded ink and forgotten cargo manifests from decommissioned freighters. I turned to the blank center pages and began to meticulously forge my own secret financial records. I detailed a series of massive, untraceable transactions dating back 20 years. I created a fictitious paper trail pointing directly to a high-security safety deposit box at the First Coastal Bank downtown. Next to the designated box number, I clearly wrote the contents: 30 physical gold bullion bars, acquired from a salvaged offshore wreck completely unregistered and untaxed. It was a fabricated fortune worth nearly $3 million in untraceable liquid assets. I made sure the handwriting looked slightly shaky, mimicking the desperate scribbles of an old man trying to inventory his hidden wealth before his memory completely faded. I left the ledger sitting open on the kitchen counter directly under the soft glow of the stove light. I placed my reading glasses carefully on top of the open page, making it look as though I had simply wandered off to bed and forgotten to secure my secrets. I knew Megan had a copy of my house key. I knew she had been driving past my property at night in her pristine white SUV, desperately looking for any angle to accelerate my eviction. I turned off the main lights and retreated down the dark hallway. At 2 in the morning, the front door lock clicked with a sharp metallic snap. I was standing perfectly still in the dark hallway, hidden entirely by the deep shadows of the coat closet. The heavy wooden door swung open with a quiet groan that echoed slightly in the silent house. Megan slipped inside. She was wearing a dark designer trench coat, her movements fast, jerky, and frantic. She did not look like a confident corporate executive preparing for a major real estate acquisition. She looked exactly like a desperate scavenger. She bypassed the living room entirely and moved silently straight toward my home office, but her eyes caught the soft illumination radiating from the kitchen. I watched her freeze when she saw the open leather ledger resting conspicuously on the counter. She crept forward, her eyes scanning the dark perimeter of the hallway to ensure I was fully asleep in my bedroom. When she reached the counter, she looked down at the pages. Even from the shadows, I could see her posture shift dramatically. Her breath caught in her throat. She leaned in closer, reading the fabricated inventory of unregistered gold bullion. Her insatiable greed completely overrode any sense of caution, logic, or basic common sense. She pulled her smartphone from her trenchcoat pocket. The bright flash illuminated her face in the dark kitchen. She took a photograph of the left page, then the right page, perfectly capturing the fake safety deposit box number and the bank location. Her hands were shaking with pure, unfiltered adrenaline. She believed she had just stumbled upon the ultimate jackpot, a hidden fortune she could liquidate immediately to save her husband's failing business without a single corporate auditor noticing. She slipped the phone back into her pocket, turned around, and quietly exited my house. She took the bait flawlessly. Standing in the quiet darkness of my hallway, listening to her car drive away, I thought about the brutal winters I spent working the bay in the early 70s. Long before I owned a fleet of heavy salvage cranes and massive dry docks, I made my living pulling commercial crab traps from the freezing coastal waters. It was backbreaking, unforgiving labor that taught me the fundamental rules of survival and strategic advantage. The most important lesson I learned on those rusted boats, working alongside men who had salt baked into their skin, was the absolute necessity of patience. You cannot chase a crab through the murky water. If you aggressively hunt your prey, you only exhaust your own resources and alert the target to your presence. True trapping requires cold mechanical calculation. You build a sturdy steel cage, you secure the absolute best bait inside the center mesh, and then you sink it deep in the dark water and walk away. You let the prey's own insatiable appetite do the heavy lifting. The crab crawls into the trap willingly, blinded by the promise of an easy meal, completely oblivious to the mechanism locking shut behind it. Megan operated exactly like a bottom feeder. She lacked the discipline to build her own wealth, so she scavenged for the easiest possible score. She could not resist the promise of untraceable gold. By leaving that ledger on the counter, I did not force her to commit another federal felony. I simply opened the door to the cage and let her walk inside under her own power. I walked into the kitchen, picked up the leather ledger, and tossed it directly into the trash can. The trap was already set at the bank, and the bait had served its exact purpose. By 9 o'clock the following morning, Megan marched through the heavy revolving glass doors of First Coastal Bank downtown, radiating unearned authority. She bypassed the standard teller line and demanded immediate unsupervised access to the high-security vault. She presented the bank staff with the forged power of attorney and the digital photograph of my ledger, loudly insisting that I was cognitively impaired and that she needed to secure my physical assets for my own medical protection. Because the safety deposit box account had been secretly flagged by Bradley weeks ago, the bank employees played their part without hesitation. They escorted her into the cold steel vault. When Megan realized she did not have the physical brass key for the specific box, she arrogantly authorized the bank to drill the lock, explicitly agreeing to pay the destruction fee from her own account. The maintenance technician, wearing a heavy leather apron, spent 20 agonizing minutes grinding through the heavy steel locking mechanism while Megan tapped her foot impatiently. When the metal door finally swung open, Megan eagerly pulled the long metal drawer out and slammed it onto the inspection table. She ripped off the lid. The box was completely empty. There were no gold bars, no hidden millions, and no untraceable cash. Her face contorted in absolute rage and confusion as she stared into the barren metal container, realizing the millions she had mentally spent were a phantom. But her empty-handed disappointment was the absolute least of her problems. The instant the bank technician drilled through that specific flagged lock under her direct authorization, a silent digital tripwire was activated in the bank's central mainframe. Her use of the forged power of attorney to forcibly breach a secure financial vault was automatically logged as a severe security breach, triggering an automated fraud alert to the bank manager. The manager immediately locked down the vault doors from the outside and dialed federal authorities. The cage had officially snapped shut. The automated fraud alert from First Coastal Bank was just the beginning of Megan's absolute nightmare. Although the bank manager lacked the immediate authority to physically arrest her on the vault floor, he immediately confiscated the drilled deposit box and forcibly escorted her off the premises under the watchful eyes of armed security. She staggered out of the heavy glass doors completely empty-handed. Her fantasy of untraceable gold bullion shattered into pieces on the polished marble floor. The sheer panic set in before she even reached her pristine white SUV in the parking garage. She had mentally spent those millions to cover their catastrophic debts and fund her lavish lifestyle. Now the phantom safety net was completely gone, and the aggressive corporate lenders backing Sterling Horizons Group were demanding immediate tangible collateral. She drove recklessly across town directly to Aaron's temporary downtown office. My private investigator tracked her vehicle, noting her erratic speeding and dangerous lane changes. When she burst into Aaron's executive suite, the walls were practically closing in on them. Through the audio surveillance bug Bradley had discreetly managed to place near Aaron's desk weeks prior, I listened to the raw desperation in her voice. Megan screamed that the hidden fortune did not exist, blaming me for creating a delusional inventory. She insisted their only remaining lifeline was the massive commercial bridge loan. But the corporate bank had set a firm Friday deadline. They required the original signed property deed of the marina to secure the multi-million-dollar funding. Aaron pacing frantically argued that I would never voluntarily sign away the physical property rights. Megan's response was swift and merciless. She demanded that Aaron personally forge my signature on the official deed, bypassing me entirely. She pressured him relentlessly, declaring that if he did not finalize the loan today, they would both face total bankruptcy and federal ruin by Monday. Aaron's moral cowardice won the argument in less than 10 minutes. He agreed to commit the ultimate property crime to appease his wife's frantic demands. But forging a federal property deed requires more than just ink on a page. It requires a state-licensed notary to legally certify the false signature. Aaron grabbed the unnotarized deed from his office safe and rushed out the door into the overcast afternoon. Bradley's private investigator remained firmly on his tail, tracking Aaron's black sedan to a desolate coffee shop parking lot on the industrial edge of the city. The investigator parked at a discreet distance, deploying a high-definition telephoto lens capable of capturing sharp text through tempered glass. I watched the live video feed from my kitchen table. A rusted gray sedan pulled up beside Aaron's vehicle. A disgraced, corrupt local notary, a man Bradley knew had previously been investigated for real estate fraud, stepped out and slid into Aaron's passenger seat. The camera zoomed in flawlessly. I watched in crystal clear high definition as Aaron placed the official marina deed on the center console. He did not hesitate for a single second. He gripped a blue ink pen and smoothly mechanically replicated my exact signature on the bottom line. The corrupt notary did not ask for identification or verification. He simply accepted a thick manila envelope stuffed with physical cash from Aaron, pulled out his official state embosser, and aggressively stamped the forged document right there in the front seat. The investigator captured a perfect, undeniable sequence of photographs, documenting the exchange of cash, the application of the forged signature, and the illegal notary stamp. The visual evidence was absolute. Aaron was caught on camera executing a major property crime in broad daylight. Watching that high-definition footage on my encrypted laptop sent a sharp, agonizing ache radiating through my chest. It was not the shock of the theft that hurt, but the profound intimacy of the betrayal. I stared at the screen, freezing the frame exactly when Aaron's hand glided across the legal document. I recognized the sharp angles and the distinctive loop of the capital letter S. It was a flawless forgery because I was the one who had taught him how to write it. My mind drifted back more than 3 decades to a warm summer evening at this very same kitchen table. Aaron was just 6 years old, gripping a thick yellow pencil with frustrating clumsiness, trying to learn cursive. I had sat right beside him for hours, placing my large, calloused hand over his tiny fingers, patiently guiding him through the motions. I taught him the specific rhythm of our family name, emphasizing the profound pride that came with signing it. I told him that a man's signature was his ultimate bond, a mark of unbreakable integrity that he must protect at all costs. He practiced for weeks until he could mimic my handwriting, perfectly proud that his letters looked exactly like his father's. Now, 34 years later, he had taken that exact childhood lesson, a moment built on pure paternal love, and ruthlessly weaponized it to steal my life's work. He used the very signature I taught him to erase my existence from the legal record. The sorrow of that corrupted memory quickly hardened into cold, impenetrable steel. Any lingering hesitation I harbored about completely destroying his corporate future vanished in that exact moment. The consequences of Aaron's parking lot transaction moved with terrifying speed. By Thursday afternoon, Bradley's secure server intercepted a massive digital notification from the federal lending institution. Aaron had immediately submitted the fraudulently notarized deed to the corporate underwriters. Believing the collateral was absolutely secure and legally binding, the bank officially approved the massive commercial bridge loan for Sterling Horizons Group. The approval authorized the immediate transfer of nearly $8 million into Aaron's corporate accounts, explicitly designated for the acquisition and demolition of my salvage yard. But in his blind rush to secure the funds before the Saturday launch gala, Aaron had triggered a catastrophic legal trap. By transmitting a known forged federal property document across state lines to a federally insured banking institution, he had officially crossed the threshold from local civil disputes into severe federal crimes. He had definitively committed aggravated identity theft, felony forgery, and massive federal wire fraud. Bradley immediately compiled the approved loan documents, the telephoto surveillance photographs, and the audio recordings of Megan's frantic demands. We did not notify the local police. Bradley routed the entire comprehensive evidence package directly to a trusted contact within the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division. The federal agents quietly opened an active criminal dossier on Sterling Horizons Group. Aaron genuinely believed he had won the war. He had the multi-million-dollar loan approval, he held the forged property deed, and he was actively preparing to host the city's financial elite at my marina on Saturday night. I was completely oblivious to the fact that his monumental victory was actually an airtight federal indictment wrapping tightly around his neck. The federal building downtown felt colder than the winter air coming off the harbor. I sat in a sterile, windowless conference room across a heavy steel table from Assistant United States Attorney Vance. Bradley sat beside me, meticulously arranging the mountain of physical and digital evidence we had accumulated over the past agonizing weeks. This was not a standard civil dispute over a marina property line. This was the systematic dismantling of a sprawling corporate criminal enterprise. Bradley slid the first thick black folder across the polished metal. It contained the high-definition telephoto surveillance photographs of Aaron handing the forged property deed to the corrupt notary in the desolate coffee shop parking lot, perfectly capturing the illegal stamp hitting the counterfeit signature. Beside it, we placed the bank routing numbers, proving he directly wired the $10,000 bribe to Dr. Thorne from his personal device. Vance scrutinized the offshore banking registries and the intercepted wire clearinghouse logs with clinical precision. We then presented the digital trail of Megan's desperate attempt to illegally cash out my $2 million life insurance policy under a completely fabricated terminal illness clause. The prosecutor's eyes narrowed sharply as he traced the undeniable chain of escalating federal felonies. Aaron had personally authorized the massive commercial bridge loan using a fraudulent legal document, crossing the absolute threshold of federal wire fraud and permanently sealing his fate. Vance did not need to ask clarifying questions. The forensic financial tracking provided by Bradley's private investigator was flawlessly airtight. The evidence proved premeditated medical fraud, criminal conspiracy, aggravated identity theft, and massive federal wire fraud. Aaron and Megan had built a fragile house of cards on a foundation of sheer arrogance, completely oblivious to the fact that every single electronic signature and desperate email had been automatically logged and compiled by federal regulators. Vance closed the final folder with a sharp, echoing snap. The federal government officially had everything required to secure mandatory multi-decade prison sentences for both of my children. Vance folded his hands and leaned back in his leather executive chair. He confirmed in a flat, emotionless tone that the United States Department of Justice was fully prepared to issue immediate unsealed arrest warrants for Aaron, Megan, and the corrupt Dr. Thorne. The standard federal protocol dictated an early morning raid at their respective upscale residences, dragging them out in handcuffs before the morning commute began. However, Bradley raised his hand, stopping the seasoned prosecutor mid-sentence. We proposed a highly specific tactical alternative designed for maximum psychological and financial impact. Aaron was hosting his extravagant launch gala for Sterling Horizons Group on Saturday night directly on the main pier of my salvage yard. He had explicitly invited the absolute highest echelon of the city's financial elite, prominent commercial bankers, and powerful local politicians to publicly announce his fraudulent acquisition of my waterfront property. I wanted the execution of those federal warrants to happen precisely at the climax of his grand midnight finale. I looked directly into the prosecutor's eyes and explained the absolute necessity of this very public takedown. Aaron had weaponized his corporate ambition to systematically erase my existence and humiliate me in front of my own community. A quiet morning arrest would allow him to hire aggressive crisis management firms to spin a narrative of a simple bureaucratic misunderstanding. A coordinated federal raid in front of his wealthy investors and aggressive corporate lenders would permanently obliterate his reputation and completely dismantle his fraudulent real estate empire in a single undeniable strike. Vance considered the strategic value of a highly visible arrest for a white-collar crime of this massive magnitude. It would serve as a brutal, highly publicized warning to the corrupt local judges and fraudulent medical professionals who quietly enabled this exact type of elder abuse. After a heavy, calculated silence, Vance slowly nodded his head. He agreed to hold the arrest warrants in absolute secrecy for 48 more hours. The trap was set for Saturday night. I returned to my quiet house on Friday evening, the silence feeling completely different than it had just a few weeks ago. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of an old man waiting to be discarded by his own flesh and blood. It was the sharp, highly charged quiet before a massive, unstoppable storm. I walked into my dimly lit bedroom and opened the heavy wooden doors of my cedar closet. I bypassed the worn flannel shirts and heavy canvas work jackets I wore every day working on the rusted municipal pier. Reaching all the way to the very back, I pulled out a protective plastic garment bag. Inside hung my absolute best charcoal wool suit. It was meticulously tailored, razor sharp, and carried a profound, agonizing history woven into its fabric. I carried the suit to the ironing board and plugged in the heavy iron, waiting for the steam to hiss violently into the cold room. The last time I wore this specific charcoal suit was the absolute darkest day of my entire life. I wore it standing beside an open grave in the freezing December rain, burying my beautiful wife after her sudden, brutal battle with aggressive cancer. That suit had absorbed the uncontrollable tears of a man who genuinely thought his world had permanently ended. I carefully pressed the lapels, meticulously smoothing out the deep wrinkles accumulated over years of neglected disuse. I was preparing to wear it again for a tragedy of a completely different nature. On that rainy December day, I buried the woman who gave my life its ultimate purpose. Tomorrow night, I would be burying the man my son had consciously chosen to become. I was putting on my armor to officially mourn the total death of my family line. Aaron had completely murdered the innocent boy I raised, replacing him with a ruthless corporate predator willing to destroy his own father for a bridge loan. As the hot steam rose from the dark wool, I accepted that the loving father in me had already died. I was strictly a cold, calculating tactician, now preparing to execute a flawless, devastating strike. The morning of the gala finally arrived with a thick, ominous coastal fog rolling heavily off the churning ocean. I was sitting quietly at my kitchen table, drinking bitter black coffee, mentally reviewing the precise timeline for the midnight federal raid, when a heavy, aggressive pounding completely shattered the quiet morning peace. It was not a polite, neighborly knock. It was the demanding, violent strike of someone expecting absolute and immediate compliance. I walked down the short hallway and looked through the reinforced brass peephole. Two massive, burly men wearing generic, poorly fitting white medical scrubs were standing aggressively on my front porch. They were clearly not standard local municipal paramedics. They had the hard, flat, unfeeling eyes of private muscle hired specifically for dirty, under-the-table work. Megan had officially launched her desperate preemptive strike. She knew the massive launch gala was tonight, and she was absolutely terrified I might show up and cause a scene in front of her wealthy investors. She had prepared the ground to take everything I owned by force if necessary. Utilizing the fraudulent medical commitment papers signed by the heavily bribed Dr. Thorne, she had hired these private orderlies to physically drag me out of my own home and lock me inside a secure psychiatric ward before the high-end caterers even arrived at the marina. She wanted me heavily sedated, chemically restrained and strapped to a sterile hospital bed while she drank expensive champagne on my wooden docks. The taller of the two men banged his heavy fist against the solid wood again, loudly announcing through the door that they had official medical authorization to enter the premises and secure a severe danger to the public. Megan was attempting to violently remove the final human obstacle to her complete corporate victory. She genuinely believed her forged legal documents gave these aggressive men the absolute, unquestionable right to break down my front door and legally abduct me. The final explosive confrontation was not going to wait until the midnight gala. It was starting right now on my front porch. I unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt and pulled the front door open just enough to stand squarely in the frame, blocking any view of the interior. The sheer physical size of the two men standing on my porch was clearly meant to be a brutal intimidation tactic. The taller one immediately stepped forward, attempting to wedge his thick steel-toed boot against the door jamb to prevent me from closing it. He held up a metal clipboard displaying Dr. Thorne's fraudulent commitment order. He spoke with the practiced mechanical tone of a man who enjoyed legally sanctioned violence, informing me that I had been deemed an immediate danger to myself and others. He demanded I step out onto the porch, quietly, explicitly warning me that any resistance would result in physical restraints and immediate chemical sedation. They were fully prepared to drag a 70-year-old man out of his home in handcuffs. I did not raise my voice, and I did not step back. I maintained absolute, unwavering eye contact with the lead orderly while reaching calmly into the interior breast pocket of my heavy wool cardigan. I did not pull out a defensive weapon. I withdrew a crisp, heavily embossed legal document that Bradley had personally couriered to my house late last night under the cover of darkness. It was a formal federal injunction explicitly signed in wet ink by a sitting United States District Court judge. I unfolded the thick, premium paper and pressed it firmly against the orderly's chest, forcing his hand to take it. I told him in a voice as cold as the morning fog that the medical order he was holding was entirely fraudulent and served as the centerpiece of an active federal wire fraud investigation. I strongly advised him to read the federal judge's signature very carefully before he chose to make the absolute worst mistake of his entire life. The tall orderly glanced down at the document with visible arrogant annoyance, clearly expecting a fabricated doctor's note or a meaningless civil complaint that he could easily ignore. But as his eyes scanned the bold capitalized text dominating the top of the page, his aggressive posture instantly evaporated into thin air. He recognized the official seal of the United States District Court and the explicit legal language detailing an active high-level federal probe into Dr. Thorne's medical practices. The injunction did not merely nullify the psychiatric hold. It explicitly stated that any attempt to physically enforce the fraudulent medical order would immediately constitute federal kidnapping, severe false imprisonment, and deliberate obstruction of justice. The mandatory minimum sentence for those combined charges was 20 hard years in a federal penitentiary. The orderly swallowed hard, his broad face rapidly losing its arrogant flush. He quickly handed the clipboard back to his partner, who leaned in to read the devastating legal text for himself. These men were strictly hired muscle paid a few $100s completely off the books to handle messy, low-level family disputes. They were absolutely not prepared to face the unyielding wrath of the Federal Bureau of Investigation or to serve decades in prison for a desperate woman they barely knew. The chilling realization hit them simultaneously. Megan had not just hired them for a routine extraction. She had unknowingly positioned them to be the disposable fall guys in a massive federal conspiracy. The taller man carefully handed the federal injunction back to me, avoiding my gaze entirely. He muttered a quick, incredibly nervous apology, grabbed his partner firmly by the shoulder of his scrub top, and turned swiftly toward the driveway. They did not walk away with pride. They practically sprinted back to their unmarked gray transport van. Within 30 seconds, the powerful engine roared to life, and the van tore recklessly down the street, disappearing completely into the thick morning fog. I quietly closed the heavy wooden door and slowly locked the brass deadbolt, officially sealing the damp, freezing fog outside. The silence that instantly fell over the house was absolute and profound. I walked back into the warm kitchen and poured a fresh cup of black coffee from the glass carafe, watching the dark liquid swirl and release a thick cloud of steam into the chilled air. Just a few short weeks ago, the deep, unbroken silence of this empty house would have felt like a crushing physical weight on my chest. It would have constantly reminded me of my wife's permanent absence and the devastating, heartbreaking reality that my only son was actively plotting to destroy my legacy. But standing here today, the silence felt entirely different. It felt like a pristine, perfectly cleared battlefield waiting for the final engagement. I stood motionless by the kitchen window, sipping the bitter, scalding coffee, feeling absolutely no residual adrenaline from the tense confrontation on the porch. My mind had completely hardened into absolute, impenetrable stone. There was no more lingering sadness, no misplaced parental guilt, and absolutely no desperate hope for a last-minute family reconciliation. The man who had patiently taught Aaron how to fish off the rusted municipal pier, the deeply proud father who had happily paid for his incredibly expensive business degrees, was entirely dead and gone. In his place stood a cold, meticulous tactician who had spent 40 grueling years surviving the brutal, unforgiving ocean. The ocean teaches you a fundamental truth: hesitation equals death. When a massive storm hits your vessel, you do not cry out for mercy or attempt to negotiate with the freezing waves. You secure the heavy hatches, you brace your feet firmly against the wooden deck, and you steer directly into the most violent part of the swell. I drank the rest of my coffee in the perfect, unbroken quiet, fully prepared to completely sink my son's fraudulent corporate fleet. The profound, meditative silence in the kitchen was violently shattered by the sharp, demanding ring of my secure burner phone resting on the granite counter. The digital screen flashed an unrecognized local number, but I already knew precisely who was waiting on the other end of the line. I tapped the screen and lifted the phone slowly to my ear without saying a single word. Megan's voice practically vibrated through the small speaker, shrill, frantic, and completely unhinged. The two private orderlies had clearly called her from their fleeing van to abruptly quit, completely abandoning her fraudulent medical abduction plan without explanation. She was utterly furious, her carefully constructed corporate facade rapidly crumbling under the sheer, suffocating panic of losing total control of the narrative. She screamed directly into the phone, demanding to know exactly how I had managed to scare off her expensive hired muscle. She did not wait for an answer. Her frantic panic rapidly morphed into raw, venomous threats. She informed me that she had officially hired an entire team of armed private security guards specifically for the massive launch gala tonight. She explicitly stated that I was permanently barred from stepping a single foot onto the marina property. She aggressively reminded me that Aaron now possessed the newly notarized deed legally making the salvage yard the exclusive corporate property of Sterling Horizons Group. If I even attempted to drive my truck down the coastal highway toward the docks, she swore she would have me immediately arrested, handcuffed in front of the city's elite and thrown into a municipal holding cell for criminal trespassing. She was desperately trying to build an impenetrable fortress around her stolen kingdom, terrified beyond reason that the actual king might show up to reclaim his stolen throne. I listened to her frantic, breathless threats until she finally paused to gasp for air. I did not argue, I did not explain the massive federal trap waiting for her, and I did not raise my voice in anger. I simply pressed the red button to end the call, leaving her screaming into dead air. I was definitely going to that party tonight. The transformation of my municipal salvage yard was sickeningly thorough. By 10 o'clock on Saturday night, the heavy rusted cranes and battered shipping containers had been completely obscured by towering walls of pristine white canvas and cascading floral arrangements. A massive temporary stage had been constructed directly over the main wooden docks draped in expensive midnight blue velvet. A small army of high-end caterers weaved effortlessly through the growing crowd, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with crystal champagne flutes and delicate expensive hors d'oeuvres. The harsh functional floodlights I typically use to guide damaged freighters into the slip had been entirely replaced by soft ambient spotlights that illuminated the churning harbor water below. Aaron and Megan stood at the center of the elevated stage, practically glowing under the expensive lighting. They were shaking hands and clinking glasses with the absolute highest echelon of the city's financial elite. I recognized prominent commercial bankers, aggressive real estate developers, and a handful of corrupt local politicians who had likely helped fast-track their fraudulent corporate permits. Megan was radiating a triumphant, arrogant energy, wearing a designer gown that cost more than I used to make in a year pulling crab traps. She was actively introducing Aaron as the visionary founder of Sterling Horizons Group, loudly bragging about the imminent demolition of the primitive salvage yard beneath their feet. They were throwing a massive multi-million-dollar victory party funded entirely by a federally approved bridge loan secured through absolute, undeniable forgery. They were publicly celebrating their flawless theft. The sheer arrogance of their display was breathtaking. They genuinely believed they had won the war. They had absolutely no idea that every single smile, handshake, and toast was pushing them closer to a mandatory federal prison sentence. The trap was heavily baited, and the guests of honor had already swallowed the hook. I pulled off the coastal highway and steered my battered, rusted, heavy-duty work truck directly down the main access road toward the marina. The entrance was barricaded by a polished valet stand surrounded by a fleet of pristine black town cars and imported European luxury sedans. I did not slow down or ask for permission. I drove my dented, mud-splattered truck straight up to the entrance, bypassing the queue entirely, and threw the heavy gear shift into park directly next to the valet podium. A young attendant in a crisp white vest stepped forward, his eyes wide with panic, stammering that this was a private, highly secured corporate event. I ignored him completely, killing the loud diesel engine and stepping out into the cold night air. Megan had kept her promise. A line of 6 burly, heavily armed private security guards immediately detached from the perimeter fence and moved aggressively to intercept me. They had clearly been given strict orders to physically bar my entry at all costs. I did not brace for a physical fight. I simply adjusted the cuffs of my tailored charcoal wool suit and kept walking forward with absolute purpose. The lead guard reached out a massive hand to shove me back toward my truck, but he froze inches from my chest. Bradley stepped seamlessly out of the passenger side of my truck and fell into step right beside me. He wasn't dressed in a tuxedo. He wore a sharp, severe federal litigation suit, and his right hand casually rested near the interior pocket of his jacket. Bradley locked eyes with the lead security guard and gave a single, imperceptible shake of his head. The guard recognized the immediate, unquestionable legal authority radiating from the silent attorney. He quickly lowered his hand, grabbed his radio mic, and ordered his men to step aside. The barricade parted flawlessly, and we walked through. As I walked down the main thoroughfare toward the illuminated stage, the thick, heavy scent of raw diesel fuel and ancient salt water filled my lungs. The expensive caterers had desperately tried to mask the smell with imported floral arrangements and scented heat lamps, but you cannot easily erase the deeply ingrained scent of a working harbor. This was my absolute domain. I knew the exact depth of the freezing water beneath the wooden planks. I knew the specific groan the heavy steel pilings made when the tide shifted, and I knew the exact history of every rusted bolt holding this entire property together. Looking up at the stage, I watched Aaron adjusting the cuffs of his tailored, expensive tuxedo, laughing loudly at a joke told by a commercial banker. He looked like a perfectly cast actor playing the role of a corporate titan. He was playing pretend on a heavy timber dock he had absolutely never sweated to build. When Aaron was a teenager, I tried to teach him the brutal, necessary mechanics of salvage work. I handed him a heavy steel wrench and asked him to help me secure a listing barge during a violent summer storm. He lasted exactly 20 minutes before throwing the wrench into the harbor, screaming that the grease was ruining his clothes and the physical labor was beneath him. He had always despised the physical reality of this marina. He only valued the abstract financial equity the land represented. He wanted the crown, but he was entirely unwilling to bleed for the kingdom. Now he stood on my stage, drinking expensive champagne, wearing a tuxedo paid for by my forged signature, completely oblivious to the fact that the actual king had just breached the castle walls to reclaim his throne. I did not hide in the shadows or linger at the edges of the extravagant party. I walked with absolute measured purpose directly down the center aisle of the crowd, parting the sea of wealthy investors and corporate bankers. The stark contrast of my grim charcoal morning suit against the sea of celebratory tuxedos immediately drew whispered attention. Megan noticed me first. I saw the champagne flute slip slightly in her hand, her perfectly manicured face draining of all color as pure, unfiltered panic flashed in her eyes. She frantically nudged Aaron, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. Aaron turned, and the confident, arrogant smile instantly vanished from his face. He stared at me, marching toward his elevated stage, realizing that his expensive private security team had failed completely. But Aaron was a cornered animal, and his immediate instinct was to aggressively control the public narrative before I could utter a single word to his lenders. Instead of retreating, he stepped aggressively to the front of the stage and snatched the microphone from its heavy metal stand. He signaled the audio technician to cut the soft background music. The sudden echoing silence caused all 150 high-net-worth guests to turn their heads toward me. Aaron gripped the microphone tightly and forced a condescending, deeply patronizing smile. He projected his voice over the massive speakers, echoing out across the dark harbor. He loudly apologized to his wealthy investors for the interruption, pointing directly down at me. With a voice dripping with fake, sickening compassion, he publicly attempted to humiliate me, announcing to the entire crowd of financial elites that I was simply a confused, wandering senior who had tragically escaped his medical caregivers. He was desperately attempting to use his fraudulent narrative to completely invalidate my presence before the federal trap could snap shut. The harsh reverberation of Aaron's amplified voice echoed off the white canvas tents, painting me as a tragic, senile escapee to the wealthy elite. The prominent investors exchanged uncomfortable, pitying glances, entirely ready to accept his carefully fabricated narrative. I did not break my stride, and I did not utter a single word of protest from the floor. I walked directly to the wooden steps of the temporary stage, my heavy boots thudding against the timber with absolute, measured certainty. Aaron stood at the edge, his tailored tuxedo starkly contrasting with my severe charcoal morning suit, looking down at me with a sickening mixture of false sympathy and authentic venom. He fully expected me to shout. He wanted a frantic, undignified tantrum that would perfectly validate his claim of my mental decline and secure his stolen empire. I gave him nothing but cold, impenetrable silence. I climbed the stairs and stepped onto the midnight blue velvet platform, invading his carefully constructed spotlight. Aaron froze entirely, the arrogant smirk dying instantly on his lips as I breached his physical space. The sheer, terrifying gravity of my presence paralyzed him completely. I reached out my calloused hand, wrapping firmly around the heavy metal barrel of the microphone. I did not yank it violently. I simply gripped it with an unwavering, absolute authority that completely overpowered his fragile resistance. His fingers went slack, and he surrendered the device without a single fight, stepping backward as if he had been physically burned by the contact. The soft murmurs of the high-net-worth crowd instantly vanished. 150 powerful corporate bankers and elite politicians fell into a suffocating, absolute silence. They were no longer looking at a confused senior citizen. They were staring at the undisputed king of the harbor, standing firmly on his own dock, holding the undisputed power of the floor. I looked out over the sea of expensive designer gowns and sharp custom suits, holding the microphone steady in my grip. I did not introduce myself or offer polite corporate pleasantries. I spoke with the flat clinical precision of a man delivering a terminal diagnosis. I welcomed the gathered elite to my personal municipal salvage yard, explicitly stating that I had exclusively owned, operated, and bled on these exact wooden docks for 40 unbroken years. I then turned my gaze directly toward the cluster of prominent commercial lenders standing near the front row, the very men who had authorized the massive capital injection for Sterling Horizons Group. I announced clearly without a single tremor in my voice that the spectacular corporate vision Aaron had sold them was a complete criminal fabrication. I informed the silent crowd that the multi-million-dollar commercial bridge loan currently funding this lavish gala, the expensive catering, and the ridiculous velvet stage was secured by a blatant, undeniable federal crime. I stated precisely that the property deed presented to their corporate underwriters had been brutally forged in a desolate coffee shop parking lot just days prior, completely bypassing my legal authorization. The reaction was instantaneous and devastatingly visual. The polished faces of the banking executives drained of all color, replacing champagne flush with stark, sheer terror. Whispers erupted like a sudden violent storm, sharp and frantic as investors rapidly calculated the catastrophic financial exposure of a fraudulent collateral agreement. Aaron's entire house of cards was fundamentally collapsing in real time, completely exposed under the harsh, unyielding glare of the ambient stage spotlights. I had not come to argue about family boundaries or demand a private apology. I had come to detonate a precise, undeniable financial bomb directly in the center of his fraudulent corporate empire. The public destruction of their carefully curated image sent Megan into a state of absolute unhinged panic. She dropped her crystal champagne flute, the fragile glass shattering violently against the wooden stage planks. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, frantically signaling the remaining private security contractors hovering near the catering tents. She screamed that I was a dangerous trespasser, desperately ordering the armed guards to physically remove me from the platform immediately. 3 heavily built men in dark tactical uniforms immediately pushed through the crowd of terrified investors reaching for their utility belts, fully prepared to drag me out by brute force. They never made it past the first row of tables. From the dark shadowed edges of the marina beyond the reach of the expensive ambient lighting, a solid wall of men stepped forward in perfect unison. Hector, my loyal salvage foreman, led the charge. He was flanked by 8 of my heaviest, most hardened harbor crew members, men wearing stained canvas jackets and heavy steel-toed boots. Hector had worked by my side for 25 brutal years, pulling wrecked hulls out of the freezing Atlantic. When his daughter needed emergency tuition for her nursing degree, I paid the balance without a second thought or a signed contract. That profound loyalty could not be bought, reasoned with, or intimidated by corporate rent-a-cops. Hector crossed his massive, scarred arms, stepping squarely into the path of the lead security guard. The crew mirrored his unwavering stance, forming an impenetrable human barricade around the perimeter of the stage. The private guards stopped dead in their tracks, instantly recognizing the brutal, uncompromising resolve radiating from men who fought the unforgiving ocean for a living. Megan's hysterical demands fell on completely deaf ears. My crew held the line, flawlessly neutralizing her violent counterattack and guaranteeing my absolute control of the stage. The physical intervention of my crew sent a shockwave of raw tension through the crowd, but Aaron was a cornered predator desperate to salvage his rapidly crumbling kingdom. He realized that physical force was no longer a viable option against my loyal men, so he pivoted aggressively back to desperate legal deception. He stepped forward, his face flushed with panicked, uncontrollable rage, and loudly called me a bitter, delusional liar in front of the entire assembly. He shouted to the terrified commercial bankers that my accusations of federal forgery were the sad, desperate fabrications of a man entirely losing his grip on reality. With a theatrical, aggressive flourish, Aaron reached into the interior breast pocket of his expensive designer tuxedo jacket. He pulled out a thick, folded legal document, snapping it open in the cold night air to display the official notary stamps. He waved the crisp paper aggressively toward the front row of investors, declaring to everyone that it was an ironclad, legally binding power of attorney. He confidently projected his voice over the frantic murmurs, claiming that I had voluntarily signed away all my administrative and financial rights weeks ago due to my severe declining mental health. He insisted the property transfer to Sterling Horizons Group was entirely legitimate and legally untouchable. He stood there practically vibrating with arrogant defiance, claiming he legally owns the marina land. I was desperately trying to use a completely fabricated narrative of my incompetence to override the devastating truth I had just delivered to his financial backers. The commercial lenders hesitated, their eyes darting nervously between my unwavering stoic stance and the official-looking document Aaron was violently thrusting into the air. He genuinely believed that flashing a piece of paper with a seal would instantly restore his credibility and save his multi-million-dollar loan from immediate federal seizure. Aaron held the notarized paper high, his chest heaving with desperate manufactured triumph. He genuinely believed that single sheet of crisp white paper was his impenetrable shield against the catastrophic truth I had just delivered, before the frantic murmurs of the wealthy crowd could solidify into belief. Bradley separated himself from the solid wall of Hector's hardened crew and stepped decisively onto the midnight blue velvet stage. Bradley did not possess my heavy, calloused presence. He moved with the razor-sharp lethal precision of a seasoned federal litigator preparing to deliver the final strike. He did not ask for the microphone or raise his voice to compete with Aaron's frantic shouting. Instead, Bradley walked directly into Aaron's personal space and forcefully pressed a heavy leather-bound legal dossier directly against the center of Aaron's tailored tuxedo jacket. Aaron instinctively grabbed the thick folder, his arrogant smile immediately faltering as he registered the official embossed seal of the United States Federal Treasury gleaming on the cover. Bradley turned smoothly to face the sea of terrified commercial bankers and high-net-worth investors. With a voice that cut through the cold night air like a surgical scalpel, Bradley systematically dismantled Aaron's final desperate lie. He announced with absolute, undeniable clarity that the physical property deed Aaron had brutally forged was nothing more than a worthless piece of historical scrap paper. The crowd fell into a deadly, suffocating hush as Bradley revealed the ultimate tactical trap. Exactly 10 years ago, anticipating the exact breed of corporate vulture my son would eventually become, I had legally transferred the absolute underlying deed of the entire marina property into an irrevocable blind trust. Bradley explicitly stated that the trust was permanently sealed, completely untouchable by any family member, and officially registered in a heavily guarded federal vault. Aaron was waiving a forged claim to a kingdom that had completely ceased to exist a decade ago. Aaron's hands began to visibly shake as he ripped open the heavy leather dossier, frantically scanning the complex legal terminology dominating the pristine pages. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving a stark, sickly white mask of absolute terror under the harsh ambient spotlights. For weeks, he had aggressively banked his entire multi-million-dollar corporate launch on the dangerous assumption that the power of attorney he had fraudulently authorized gave him unquestionable, blanket control over my entire estate. Bradley watched him panic with cold, clinical satisfaction, loudly clarifying the exact parameters of the legal snare to the listening bankers. The power of attorney Aaron had so confidently paraded in front of his wealthy elite lenders was fundamentally and deliberately restricted. It explicitly granted temporary administrative access solely to my basic personal checking accounts, allowing him to theoretically pay standard utility bills or municipal property taxes. It contained ironclad, federally binding clauses that granted him absolutely zero claim, zero equity, and zero transferring authority over the highly lucrative commercial waterfront property. Aaron had systematically built his massive Sterling Horizons group on a foundation of sheer, unadulterated air. He had walked into the offices of aggressive commercial lenders and secured massive capital injections using collateral he fundamentally never owned and could never legally acquire. The crisp paper he was still clutching in his sweating hand was not a master key to a real estate empire. It was a legally documented confession of aggressive medical fraud and severe elder abuse. His arrogant assumption that I was merely a simple, uneducated salvage worker had completely blinded him to the lethal reality of my financial architecture. He stared blankly at the irrevocable blind trust documents, his mind violently short-circuiting as he realized his grand visionary corporate takeover was officially dead on arrival. I watched Aaron's corporate facade violently shatter under the crushing weight of undeniable federal documentation, feeling absolutely no pity for the predator caught blindly in the snare. For the past decade, my son had aggressively snooped through my life, treating my home and my salvage yard like a pending inheritance waiting to be ruthlessly liquidated. Years ago, I noticed him casually rummaging through my wooden desk drawers and inspecting my locked filing cabinets when he thought I was busy working on the docks. I knew exactly what he was hunting for. To feed his insatiable growing greed, I constructed a massive reinforced brick storage building on the far edge of the marina property. I equipped it with heavy steel deadbolts, commercial-grade security cameras, and explicitly forbade anyone from ever entering the premises. It was a flawless, irresistible decoy. For 10 unbroken years, Aaron obsessed over that secure brick structure, genuinely convinced it housed the master property deeds, the offshore banking ledgers, and the ultimate keys to my financial kingdom. He had spent countless hours plotting how to eventually breach those heavy steel doors. He never once suspected that the highly secured building contained absolutely nothing but rusted engine blocks, obsolete maritime navigational charts, and completely useless metal scrap. While he was entirely fixated on conquering the fake fortress, I had quietly driven downtown and placed the actual irrevocable blind trust documents securely inside an impenetrable federal bank vault. I had fed his arrogance with a carefully constructed illusion, allowing him to aggressively plan his grand corporate theft, while I safely locked away the true power of the marina, where his greedy hands could never possibly reach. His obsession with the decoy had permanently blinded him to the actual battlefield. The sheer catastrophic reality of Bradley's legal revelation hit the front row of elite investors like a sudden, violent physical blow. The suffocating silence of the crowd abruptly shattered, instantly replaced by a chaotic, aggressive roar of absolute financial panic. These were not amateur participants. They were ruthless commercial bankers and high-net-worth developers who immediately understood the devastating legal implications of a fraudulent bridge loan. They realized with horrifying clarity that Aaron had just publicly committed massive, undeniable bank fraud using entirely fabricated collateral to secure their millions of dollars in capital. The Velvet Stage was no longer a platform for a visionary corporate launch. It was the active ground zero of a massive federal crime scene. The lead commercial lender, a man who had enthusiastically toasted Aaron's success just 20 minutes prior, slammed his crystal champagne flute onto a nearby catering table, shattering the fragile glass completely. He lunged aggressively toward the edge of the stage, his face purple with unhinged rage, loudly demanding the immediate unconditional return of his massive investment check. The rest of the elite crowd instantly turned on Aaron with the brutal, unforgiving ferocity of sharks smelling raw blood in the freezing water. Wealthy politicians frantically backed away toward the exit, desperately trying to distance themselves from the toxic, collapsing criminal enterprise before the cameras flashed. Powerful real estate developers shouted severe threats of immediate civil lawsuits and aggressive criminal prosecution, demanding their capital back before federal regulators permanently froze the fraudulent corporate accounts. Aaron stumbled backward against the heavy velvet curtains, completely surrounded by furious wealthy men demanding their money, utterly paralyzed by the raging monster he had aggressively created and could no longer control. The midnight blue velvet stage hummed with tension as Bradley exposed the ultimate truth to the terrified crowd of investors. Federal marshals emerged seamlessly from the perimeter of the dark marina, moving directly toward the elevated platform with absolute unyielding purpose. Megan shrieked at the top of her lungs, pointing a manicured, trembling finger straight at her husband. She screamed that she was completely innocent, claiming she had no idea the property documents were forged and that Aaron had engineered the entire banking conspiracy entirely on his own. Aaron stood completely frozen in sheer terror under the bright ambient spotlights, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as the catastrophic reality of his federal crimes finally caught up to him. The multi-million-dollar corporate empire he had spent months constructing was actively evaporating into thin air before 150 powerful witnesses. The federal marshals reached the stage with practiced tactical precision. They bypassed the terrified corporate lenders and moved straight for the center platform. Without a single word of warning, the marshals placed Aaron and Megan in cold, heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp click of the metal rings snapping shut echoed loudly over the massive sound system. Bradley stepped forward, reading the formal federal charges aloud to the stunned crowd. They were officially placed under arrest for grand larceny, interstate wire fraud, severe elder abuse, and the deliberate bribing of a licensed medical professional. Their glittering, fraudulent corporate empire collapsed into absolute ruin in a matter of seconds. The expensive champagne flutes were abandoned on nearby tables, and the high-net-worth investors began scrambling frantically toward the exit, desperately trying to distance themselves from the active federal crime scene. Aaron looked across the velvet stage, his eyes locking onto mine with desperate, pathetic pleading. Tears streamed down his expensive tuxedo lapels as he fell to his knees in front of me, begging for mercy. He begged me to use my influence, my money, my lawyers to bail him out and save him from the federal penitentiary. He cried that he was still my son, asking me to forgive his terrible mistakes one last time. I looked my son directly in the eyes. I did not flinch, and I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a perfect, unshakable calm that cut straight through his hysterical sobs. I paid for your elite education in cash. I told him, the words falling like heavy stones. You chose to use that exact education to steal from your own father. I cannot protect you from the consequences of your own bottomless greed. I turned my back on them without a shred of hesitation. The federal marshals hoisted Aaron and Megan to their feet and escorted them down the wooden stage steps toward the waiting line of flashing cruiser lights. The wealthy investors fled the docks in a panicked stampede, leaving behind their half-empty glasses and broken illusions. I stood alone on the quiet wooden dock alongside Hector and Bradley, watching the taillights of the police cruisers fade into the coastal fog. My rusted Chevy truck sat proudly in the gravel lot, a silent monument to the enduring strength of honest hard work. I had lost a son to the dark ocean of greed, but I had preserved my lifelong legacy, reclaimed my absolute freedom, and executed a flawless silent checkmate. The most profound realization that emerges from the wreckage of a family shattered by greed is that bloodline does not guarantee loyalty. For decades, I operated under the fundamental delusion that providing a comfortable life for my son would naturally cultivate respect and gratitude. I believed that shielding him from the brutal realities of the salvage yard would allow him to develop into an honorable man. Instead, my deliberate insulation bred a lethal sense of entitlement. When you hand a child the crown without forcing them to bleed for the kingdom, they eventually view the king as an obstacle. The brutal truth is that unconditional financial support often functions as a corrosive poison, eroding the very character you are desperately trying to build. I financed his elite education and underwrote his luxurious lifestyle, genuinely believing I was acting out of deep parental love. In reality, I was actively financing the construction of the weapon he would eventually use to attempt my destruction. Love without absolute boundaries is simply a vulnerability waiting to be ruthlessly exploited. This is the tragic mistake parents make. We swallow daily humiliations to avoid fracturing the fragile and ultimately fake illusion of family harmony. Silence is frequently misinterpreted as weakness by arrogant minds. For years, I chose to ignore the condescending remarks, the subtle eye rolls, and the blatant disrespect from Aaron and Megan. I endured their arrogant posturing because I valued temporary peace over necessary confrontation. However, predators do not respect compliance. They only respect boundaries enforced by undeniable consequences. By swallowing their disrespect, I inadvertently validated their aggressive behavior. They looked at my calloused hands, my rusted work truck, and my quiet demeanor, and they saw a senile, defenseless victim ripe for the taking. They failed entirely to comprehend hidden power. The capacity for stillness is the ultimate indicator of strategic power. The silent adjustment is the most devastating counterattack precisely because it utilizes their own blinding arrogance against them. While they loudly celebrated their fabricated victories, I quietly assembled an unbreakable legal fortress. You never announce your checkmate to a thief. You simply let them step blindly onto the trap and lock the heavy steel door behind them. We must also recognize the lethal danger of visible wealth versus the absolute security of invisible power. My son was entirely captivated by superficial trappings of success and visible physical assets. He lusted after the physical marina, the expensive tuxedos, the velvet stages, and the public adoration of wealthy investors. He chased the illusion of power, completely oblivious to the mechanics of actual control. I intentionally constructed a massive, heavily fortified brick building specifically to act as a decoy, feeding his obsessive greed with a hollow target. Real power is never paraded on a brightly lit stage. It is secured in sealed federal vaults, legally bound within irrevocable trusts and guarded by men whose loyalty cannot be purchased. By stripping myself of visible assets, I became completely and truly untouchable. The greatest defense against a parasite is to convince them the host is already dead. When you remove the shiny object of their obsession, they will inevitably expose their true criminal nature, trying to forcibly seize it. Aaron built a massive corporate empire on a foundation of sheer air because he was too arrogant to verify the dirt beneath his expensive leather shoes. Another crucial takeaway is the profound difference between vengeance and the restoration of order. When federal marshals placed my son in heavy steel handcuffs, I felt absolutely no triumphant joy or malicious petty personal ultimate vindication. Vengeance is an emotional, chaotic reaction driven by unresolved pain. What I executed was the clinical necessary restoration of absolute truth. I did not destroy Aaron today. Aaron systematically destroyed his own life through a documented series of federal crimes, medical fraud, and elder abuse. I simply removed the invisible financial safety net that had been protecting him from the harsh consequences of reality. True justice requires stepping aside and allowing the arrogant to be crushed by the sheer weight of their own fabricated lies. When you mistake kindness for weakness, the universe eventually corrects the imbalance with precision. I did not send my son to a federal penitentiary. His own insatiable greed forged the iron bars of his cell. As a father, you must eventually accept that you cannot save a child who is actively determined to drown. Sometimes the ultimate act of love is allowing them to hit the freezing bottom so they can finally learn how to swim. Finally, this ordeal has taught me the immeasurable value of chosen loyalty over genetic obligation. While my flesh and blood plotted to strip me of my legacy, men like Hector and Bradley stood as an impenetrable wall. True family is not determined by a birth certificate. It is forged in the trenches of hardship, proven through decades of unwavering reliability and cemented by mutual respect. Hector pulled wrecked hulls from the freezing harbor by my side, demonstrating a caliber of loyalty that greedy corporate bankers could never comprehend. Bradley navigated the lethal complexities of federal law to protect a legacy he had no personal stake in. These men defended me because they respected the sweat blood and the integrity I had poured into those wooden docks. My legacy remains entirely intact because of their immense strength. When the storm hits, you quickly discover that the people who share your last name are often the ones drilling holes in the bottom of your boat, while the strangers you treated with genuine fairness are the ones actively bailing the water. Reclaiming your dignity is the ultimate victory. I preserved my precious empire. May this story serve as a warning to every ungrateful child who mistakes parental quiet sacrifices for weakness. Never underestimate the calculated resolve of a man protecting the sacred work of his life. Subscribe to our channel today and share your thoughts in the comments.